Chapter the 7th. The Bringing In of Lord Barralonga's Party. Part 1. The conference broke up upon this announcement, but Lord Barralonga and his party were not brought to the conference gardens until long after dark. No effort was made to restrain or control the movements of the earthlings. Mr. Burley walked down to the lake with Lady Stella and the psychologist, whose name was Lion, asking and answering questions. Mr. Burley's chauffeur wandered rather disconsolately, keeping within hail of his employer. Mr. Rupert Catskill took Mr. Mush off by the arm, as if to give him instructions. Mr. Barnstaple wanted to walk about alone to recall and digest the astounding realizations of the afternoon, and to accustom himself to the wonder of this beautiful world, so beautiful, and now in the twilight so mysterious also, with its trees and flowers becoming dim and shapeless notes of pallor and blackness, and with the clear forms and gracious proportions of its buildings melting into a twilight indistinctness. The earthiness of his companions intervened between him and the world into which he felt like he might otherwise have been accepted and absorbed. He was in it, but in it only as a strange and discordant intruder. Yet he loved it already and desired it, and was passionately anxious to become a part of it. He had a vague but very powerful feeling that if only he could get away from his companions, if only in some way he could cast off his earthly clothing and everything upon him that marked him as earthly and linked him to earth, he would, by the very act of casting that off, become himself a native to Utopia. And then that this tormenting sense, this bleak, distressing strangeness would vanish out of his mind. He would suddenly find himself a Utopian in nature and reality, and it was earth that would become the incredible dream, a dream that would fade at last completely out of his mind. For a time, however, Father Emerton's need of a hearer prevented any such detachment from earthly thoughts and things. He stuck close to Mr. Barnstaple and maintained a stream of questions and comments that threw over this utopian scene the quality of some Earl's Court exhibition that the two of them were visiting and criticizing together. It was evidently so provisional, so disputable and unreal to him, that at any moment Mr. Barnstaple felt he would express no astonishment if a rift in the scenery suddenly let in the clatter of the Earl's Court railway station, or gave a glimpse of the conventional Gothic spire of St. Barnabas in the west. At first Father Emerton's mind was busy chiefly with the fact that on the morrow he was to be dealt with on account of the scene in the conference. "How can they deal with me?" he said for the fourth time. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Barnstaple. Every time Mr. Emerton began speaking, Mr. Barnstaple said, "I beg your pardon," in order to convey to him that he was interrupting a train of thought. But every time Mr. Barnstaple said, "I beg your pardon," Mr. Emerton would merely remark, "You ought to consult someone about your hearing," and then go on with what he had to say. "How can I be dealt with?" he asked Mr. Barnstaple in the circumambient dusk. "How can I be dealt with?" "Oh, psychoanalysis or something of that sort," said Mr. Barnstaple. "It takes two to play at that game," said Father Emerton, but it seemed to Mr. Barnstaple with a slight favor of relief in his tone. "Whatever they ask me, whatever they suggest to me, I will not fail. I will bear my witness." "I have no doubt they will find it hard to suppress you," said Mr. Barnstaple bitterly. For a time they walked among the tall, sweet-smelling, white-flowered shrubs in silence. Now and then Mr. Barnstaple would quicken or slacken his pace, with the idea of increasing his distance from Father Emerton, but quite mechanically Father Emerton responded to these efforts. "Promiscuity," he began again presently. "What other word could you use?" "I really beg your pardon," said Mr. Barnstaple. "What other word could I have used but promiscuity? What else could one expect, with people running about in this amazing want of costume, but the morals of a monkey's cage? They admit that our institution of marriage is practically unknown to them." "It's a different world," said Mr. Barnstaple irritably. "A different world. The laws of morality hold good for every conceivable world." "But in a world in which people propagated by fission, and there was no sex?" Morality would be simpler, but it would be the same morality. Presently Mr. Barnstaple was begging his pardon again. "I was saying that this is a lost world." "It doesn't look lost," said Mr. Barnstaple. "It has rejected and forgotten salvation." Mr. Barnstaple put his hands in his pockets and began to whistle the barcarolle from the Tales of Hoffmann very softly to himself. Would Father Emerton never leave him? Could nothing be done with Father Emerton? At the old shows at Earl's Court, there used to be wire baskets for waste paper and cigarette ends and bores generally. If one could only tip Father Emerton suddenly into some such receptacle. Salvation has been offered them, and they have rejected it and well-nigh forgotten it. And that is why we have been sent to them. We have been sent to them to recall them to the one thing that matters, to the one forgotten thing. Once more we have to raise the healing symbol, as Moses raised it in the wilderness. Ours is no light mission. We have been sent into this hell of sensuous materialism. "Oh, Lord!" said Mr. Barnstaple, and relapsed into the barcarolle. "I beg your pardon," he exclaimed again presently. "Where's the pole star? What has happened to the Wain?" Mr. Barnstaple looked up. He had not thought of the stars before, and he looked up prepared in this fresh universe to see the strangest constellations. But just as the life and size of the planet they were on ran closely parallel to the Earth's, so he beheld above him a starry vault of familiar forms. And just as the utopian world failed to be altogether parallel to its sister universe, so did these constellations seem to be a little out in their drawing. Orion, he thought, straddled wider and with a great unfamiliar nebula at one corner. And it was true. The Wain was flattened out, and the pointers pointed to a great void in the heavens. "Their pole star gone! The pointers, the Wain askew! It is symbolical," said Father Emerton. It was only too obviously going to be symbolical. Mr. Barnstaple realized that a fresh storm of eloquence was imminent from Father Emerton. At any cost, he felt this nuisance must be abated. Part 2. On Earth, Mr. Barnstaple had been a passive victim to bores of all sorts, delicately and painfully considerate of the mental limitations that made their insensitive pressure possible. But the free air of utopia had already mounted to its head and released initiatives that his excessively deferential recognition of others had hitherto restrained. He had had enough of Father Emerton. It was necessary to turn off Father Emerton, and he now proceeded to do so with a simple directness that surprised himself. "Father Emerton," he said, "I have a confession to make to you." "Ah!" cried Father Emerton. "Please, anything." "You have been walking about with me and shouting at my ears until I am strongly impelled to murder you." "If what I have said has struck home—" "It hasn't struck home. It has been a tiresome, silly, deafening jabbering in my ears. It wearies me indescribably. It prevents my attending to the marvelous things about us. I see exactly what you mean when you say that there is no pole star here, and that is symbolical. Before you begin, I appreciate the symbol, and a very obvious, weak, and ultimately inaccurate symbol it is. But you are one of those obstinate spirits who believes in spite of all evidence that the eternal hills are still eternal, and the fixed stars are fixed forever. I want you to understand that I am entirely out of sympathy with all this stuff of yours. You seem to embody all that is wrong and ugly and impossible in Catholic teaching. I agree with these utopians that there is something wrong with your mind about sex. In all probability, a nasty twist given to it in early life, and that what you keep saying and hinting about sexual life here is horrible and outrageous. And I am equally hostile to you and exasperated and repelled by you when you speak of religion proper. You make religion disgusting just as you would make sex disgusting. You are a dirty priest. What you call Christianity is a black and ugly superstition, a mere excuse for malignity and persecution. It is an outrage upon Christ. If you are a Christian, then most passionately I declare myself not a Christian. But there are other meanings for Christianity than those you put upon it, and in another sense this utopia here is Christian beyond all dreaming, utterly beyond your understanding. We have come into this glorious world which, compared to our world, is like a bowl of crystal compared to an old tin can. And you have the insufferable impudence to say that we have been sent hither as missionaries to teach them God knows what. God does know what, said Father Amerton, a little taken aback, but coming up very pluckily. Oh, cried Mr. Barnstaple, and was for a moment speechless. Listen to me, my friend, said Father Amerton, catching at his sleeve. Not for my life, cried Mr. Barnstaple, recoiling. See, down that vista, away there on the shore of the lake. Those black figures are Mr. Burley, Mr. Mush, and Lady Stella. They brought you here. They belong to your party, and you belong to them. If they had not wanted your company, you would not have been in their car. Go to them. I will not have you with me any longer. I refuse you and reject you. That is your way. This, by this little building, is mine. Don't follow me, or I will lay hands on you and bring in these utopians to interfere between us. Forgive my plainness, Mr. Amerton, but get away from me. Get away from me. Mr. Barnstaple turned, and seeing that Father Amerton stood hesitating at the parting of the ways, took to his heels and ran from him. He fled along an alley behind tall hedges, turned sharply to the right and then to the left, passed over a high bridge that crossed in front of a cascade that flung a dash of spray in his face, blundered by two couples of lovers who whispered softly in the darkling, ran deviously across flower-studded turf, and at last threw himself down, breathless, upon the steps that led up to a terrace that looked towards the lake and mountains, and was adorned, it seemed in the dim light, with squat stone figures of seated vigilant animals and men. "Ye merciful stars!" cried Mr. Barnstaple. "At last I am alone." He sat on these steps for a long time, with his eyes upon the scene about him, drinking in the satisfying realization that for a brief interval at any rate, with no earthly presence to intervene, he and Utopia were face to face. Part 3. He could not call this world the world of his dreams, because he had never dared to dream of a world so closely shaped to the desires and imaginations of his heart. But surely this world it was, or a world the very fellow of it, that had lain deep beneath the thoughts and dreams of thousands of sane and troubled men and women in the world of disorder from which he had come. It was no world of empty peace, no such golden decadence of indulgence as Mr. Catskill tried to imagine it. It was a world, Mr. Barnstaple perceived, intensely militant, conquering and to conquer, prevailing over the obduracy of force and matter, over the lifeless separations of empty space and all the antagonistic mysteries of being. In Utopia in the past, obscured by the superficial exploits of statesmen like Burley and Catskill, and the competition of traders and exploiters every whit as vile and vulgar as their earthly compeers, the work of quiet and patient thinkers and teachers had gone on, and the foundations which sustained this serene intensity of activity had been laid. How few of these pioneers had ever felt more than a transitory gleam of the righteous loveliness of the world their lives made possible? And yet even in the hate and turmoil and distresses of the days of confusion, there must have been an earnest enough of the exquisite and glorious possibilities of life. Over the foulest slums the sunset called to the imaginations of men, and from mountain ridges, across great valleys, from cliffs and hillsides, and by the uncertain and terrible splendors of the sea, men must have had glimpses of the conceivable and attainable magnificence of being. Every flower petal, every sunlit leaf, the vitality of young things, the happy moments of the human mind transcending itself in art, all these things must have been material for hope, incentive to effort, and now, at last, this world. Mr. Barnstaple lifted up his hands like one who worships to the friendly multitude of the stars above him. "I have seen," he whispered. "I have seen." Little lights and soft glows of illumination were coming out here and there over this great park of flower-like buildings and garden spaces that sloped down towards the lake. A circling aeroplane, itself a star, hummed softly overhead. A slender girl came past him down the steps and paused at the sight of him. "Are you one of the Earthlings?" came the question, and a beam of soft light shone momentarily upon Mr. Barnstaple from the bracelet on her arm. "I came today," said Mr. Barnstaple, peering up at her. "You are the man who came alone in a little machine of tin, with rubber airbags round the wheels, very rusty underneath, and painted yellow. I have been looking at it." "It is not a bad little car," said Mr. Barnstaple. "At first we thought the priest came in it with you. He is no friend of mine." "There were priests like that in Utopia many years ago. They caused much mischief among the people." "He was with the other lot," said Mr. Barnstaple. "For their week-end party, I should think him rather a mistake." She sat down a step or so above him. "It is wonderful that you should come here out of your world to us. Do you find this world of ours very wonderful? I suppose many things that seem quite commonplace to me because I have been born among them seem wonderful to you. You are not very old. I am 11. I am learning the history of the ages of confusion, and they say your world is still in an age of confusion. It is just as though you came to us out of the past, out of history. I was in the conference and I was watching your face. You love this present world of ours. At least you love it much more than your other people do. I want to live all the rest of my life in it. I wonder if that is possible. Why should it not be possible? It would be easier than sending me back. I should not be very much in the way. I should only be here for 20 or 30 years at the most, and I would learn everything I could and do everything I was told. But isn't there work that you have to do in your own world?" Mr. Barnstaple made no answer to that. He did not seem to hear it. It was the girl who presently broke the silence. "They say that when we utopians are young, before our minds and characters are fully formed and matured, we are very much like the men and women in the age of confusion. We are more egotistical then, they tell us. Life about us is still so unknown, we are adventurous and romantic. I suppose I am egotistical yet, and adventurous. And it does still seem to me that in spite of many terrible and dreadful things, there was much that must have been wildly exciting and desirable in that past, which is still so like your present. What can it have been like to have been a general entering a conquered city, or a prince being crowned, or to be rich and be able to astonish people by acts of power and benevolence, or to be a martyr led out to die for some splendid misunderstood cause? These things sound better in stories and histories than in reality," said Mr. Barnstaple after due consideration. "Did you hear Mr. Rupert Catskill, the last of the Earthlings, to make a speech? He thought romantically, but he did not look romantic. He has lived most romantically. He has fought bravely in wars. He has been a prisoner and escaped wonderfully from prison. His violent imaginations have caused the deaths of thousands of people. And presently we shall see another romantic adventurer in this Lord Baralonga they are bringing hither. He is enormously rich, and tries to astonish people with his wealth, just as you have dreamt of astonishing people. Are they not astonished?" "Romance is not reality," said Mr. Barnstaple. "He is one of a number of floundering, corrupting rich men who are a weariness to themselves and an intolerable nuisance to the rest of our world. They want to do vulgar, showy things. This man Baralonga was an assistant to a photographer, and something of an actor when a certain invention called moving pictures came into our world. He became a great prospector in the business of showing these pictures, partly by accident, partly by the unscrupulous cheating of various investors. Then he launched out into speculations in shipping, and in a trade we carry on in our world in frozen meat brought from great distances. He made food costly for many people and impossible for some, and so he grew rich. For in our world men grow weary by intercepting rather than by serving. And having become ignobly rich, certain of our politicians, for whom he did some timely services, ennobled him by giving him the title of Lord. Do you understand the things I am saying? Was your age of confusion so like ours? You did not know it was so ugly. Forgive me if I disillusion you about the age of confusion and its romantic possibilities. But I have just stepped out of the dust and disorder and noise of its indiscipline, out of limitation, cruelties, and distresses, out of a weariness in which hope dies. Perhaps if my world attracts you, you may yet have an opportunity of adventuring out of all this into its disorders. That will be an adventure indeed. Who knows what may happen between our worlds? But you will not like it, I'm afraid. You cannot imagine how dirty our world is. Dirt and disease, these are in the trailing skirts of all romance. A silence fell between them. He followed his own thoughts, and the girl sat and wondered over him. At length he spoke again. "Shall I tell you what I was thinking of when you spoke to me?" "Yes." "Your world is the consummation of 1,000,000 ancient dreams. It is wonderful. It is wonder, high as heaven. But it is a great grief to me that 2 dear friends of mine cannot be here with me to see what I am seeing. It is queer how strong the thought of them is in my mind. One has passed now beyond all the universes, alas, but the other is still in my world. You are a student, my dear. Every one of your world, I suppose, is a student here, but in our world students are a class apart. We 3 were happy together, because we were students and not yet caught into the mills of senseless toil, and we were none the less happy because we were miserably poor and often hungry together. We used to talk and dispute together in our students' debating society, discussing the disorders of our world and how someday they might be bettered. Was there, in your age of confusion, that sort of eager, hopeful, poverty-struck student life?" "Go on," said the girl, with her eyes intent on his dim profile. "In old novels I have read of just that hungry, dreaming student world." We 3 agreed that the supreme need of our time was education. We agreed that was the highest service we could join. We all set about it in our various ways, I the least useful of the 3. My friends and I drifted a little apart. They edited a great monthly periodical that helped to keep the world of science together, and my friend, serving a careful and grudging firm of publishers, edited school books for them, conducted an educational paper, and also inspected schools for our university. He was too heedless of pay and profit ever to become even passably well off, though these publishers profited greatly by his work. His whole life was a continual service of toil for teaching. He did not take as much as a month's holiday in any year in his life. While he lived, I thought little of the work he was doing, but since he died I have heard from teachers whose schools he inspected, and from book writers whom he advised, of the incessant high quality of his toil and the patience and sympathy of his work. On such lives as his, this utopia in which your sweet life is opening is founded. On such lives our world of earth will yet build its utopia. But the life of this friend of mine ended abruptly in a way that tore my heart. He worked too hard and too long through a crisis in which it was inconvenient for him to take a holiday. His nervous system broke down with shocking suddenness. His mind gave way. He passed into a phase of acute melancholia and died. For it is perfectly true, old nature has neither righteousness nor pity. This happened a few weeks ago. That other old friend and I, with his wife, who had been his tireless helper, were chief among the mourners at his funeral. Tonight the memory of that comes back to me with extraordinary vividness. I do not know how you dispose of your dead here, but on earth the dead are mostly buried in the earth. "We are burnt," said the girl. "Those who are liberal-minded in our world burn also. Our friend was burnt, and we stood and took our part in a service according to the rites of our ancient religion in which we no longer believed, and presently we saw his coffin, covered with wreaths and flowers, slide from before us out of our sight through the gates that led to the furnaces of the crematorium, and as it went, taking with it so much of my youth, I saw that my other dear old friend was sobbing, and I too was wrung to the pitch of tears to think that so valiant and devoted and industrious a life should end, as it seemed, so miserably and thanklessly. The priest had been reading a long contentious discourse by a theological writer named Paul, full of bad arguments by analogy and weak assertions. I wished that instead of the ideas of this ingenious ancient, we could have had some discourse upon the real nobility of our friend, on the pride and intensity of his work, and on his scorn for mercenary things. All his life he had worked with unlimited devotion for such a world as this, and yet I doubt if he had ever had any realization of the clearer, nobler life for man that his life and the toil of such lives as his were making sure and certain in the days to come. He lived by faith. He lived too much by faith. There was not enough sunlight in his life. If I could have him here now, and that other dear friend who grieved for him so bitterly, if I could have them both here, if I could give up my place here to them so that they could see, as I see, the real greatness of their lives reflected in these great consequences of such lives as theirs, then I could rejoice in utopia indeed. But I feel now as if I had taken my old friend's savings and was out spending them on myself. Mr. Barnstaple suddenly remembered the youth of his hearer. "Forgive me, my dear child, for running on in this fashion, but your voice was kind." The girl's answer was to bend down and brush his extended hand with her soft lips. Then suddenly she sprang to her feet. "Look at that light," she said, "among the stars." Mr. Barnstaple stood up beside her. "That is the aeroplane bringing Lord Barralonga and his party. Lord Barralonga who killed a man today. Is he a very big, strong man, ungovernable and wonderful?" Mr. Barnstaple, struck by a sudden doubt, looked sharply at the sweet upturned face beside him. "I have never seen him, but I believe he is a youngish, baldish, undersized man, who suffers very gravely from a disordered liver and kidneys. This has prevented the dissipation of his energies upon youthful sports and pleasures, and enabled him to concentrate upon the acquisition of property. And so he was able to buy the noble title that touches your imagination. Come with me and look at him." The girl stood still and met his eyes. She was 11 years old, and she was as tall as he was. "But there was no romance in the past?" "Only in the hearts of the young, and it died." "But is there no romance?" "Endless romance, and it all has to come. It comes for you." Part 4. The bringing in of Lord Barralonga and his party was something of an anticlimax to Mr. Barnstaple's wonderful day. He was tired, and quite unreasonably he resented the invasion of Utopia by these people. The two parties of earthlings were brought together in a brightly lit hall near the lawn upon which the Barralonga aeroplane had come down. The newcomers came in a group together, blinking, travel-worn and weary-looking. But it was evident they were greatly relieved to encounter other earthlings in what was to them a still intensely puzzling experience, for they had had nothing to compare with the calm and lucid discussion of the conference place. Their lapse into this strange world was still an incomprehensible riddle for them. Lord Barralonga was the owner of the gnome-like face that had looked out at Mr. Barnstaple when the large grey car had passed him on the Maidenhead Road. His skull was very low and broad above his brows, so that he reminded Mr. Barnstaple of the flat stopper of a glass bottle. He looked hot and tired. He was considerably dishevelled, as if from a struggle, and one arm was in a sling. His little brown eyes were as alert and wary as those of a wicked urchin in the hands of a policeman. Sticking close to him like a familiar spirit was a small, almost jockey-like chauffeur, whom he addressed as Ridley. Ridley's face also was marked by the stern determination of a man in a difficult position not in any manner to give himself away. His left cheek and ear had been cut in the automobile smash and were liberally adorned with sticking plaster. Miss Greta Gray, the lady of the party, was a frankly blonde beauty in a white flannel tailor-made suit. She was extraordinarily unruffled by the circumstances in which she found herself. It was as if she had no sense whatsoever of their strangeness. She carried herself with the habitual hauteur of a beautiful girl almost professionally exposed to the risk of unworthy advances, anywhere. The other two people of the party were a gray-faced, gray-clad American, also very wary-eyed, who was, Mr. Barnstaple learnt from Mr. Mush, Hunker, the cinema king, and a thoroughly ruffled-looking Frenchman, a dark, smartly dressed man, with an imperfect command of English, who seemed rather to have fallen into Lord Barrolonga's party than to have belonged to it properly. Mr. Barnstaple's mind leapt to the conclusion, and nothing occurred afterwards to change his opinion, that some interest in the cinematograph had brought this gentleman within range of Lord Barrolonga's hospitality, and that he had been caught, as a foreigner may so easily be caught, into the embrace of a thoroughly uncongenial week-end expedition. As Lord Barrolonga and Mr. Hunker came forward to greet Mr. Burley and Mr. Catskill, this Frenchman addressed himself to Mr. Barnstaple with the inquiry whether he spoke French. "I cannot understand," he said. "We were to have gone to Wiltshire, and then one horrible thing has happened after another. What is it we have come to, and what sort of people are all these people who speak most excellent French? Is it a joke of Lord Barrolonga, or a dream, or what has happened to us?" Mr. Barnstaple attempted some explanation. "Another dimension," said the Frenchman. "Another world? That is all very well, but I have my business to attend to in London. I have no need to be brought back in this way to France, some sort of France, some other France in some other world. It is too much of a joke altogether." Mr. Barnstaple attempted some further exposition. It was clear from his interlocutor's puzzled face that the phrases he used were too difficult. He turned helplessly to Lady Stella, and found her ready to undertake the task. "This lady," he said, "will be able to make things plain to you. Lady Stella, this is Monsieur Emile Dupont." The Frenchman bowed. "I am what you call a journalist and a publicist. I am interested in the cinematograph from the point of view of education and propaganda. That is why I am here with his Lordship Barrolonga." French conversation was Lady Stella's chief accomplishment. She sailed into it now very readily. She took over the elucidation of Monsieur Dupont, and only interrupted it to tell Miss Greta Gray how pleasant it was to have another woman with her in this strange world. Relieved of Monsieur Dupont, Mr. Barnstaple stood back and surveyed the little group of earthlings in the center of the hall and the circle of tall, watchful utopians about them, and rather aloof from them. Mr. Burley was being distantly cordial to Lord Barrolonga, and Mr. Hunker was saying what a great pleasure it was to him to meet Britain's foremost statesman. Mr. Catskill stood in the most friendly manner beside Barrolonga. They knew each other well, and Father Amerton exchanged comments with Mr. Mush. Ridley and Penk, after some moments of austere regard, had gone apart to discuss the technicalities of the day's experience in undertones. Nobody paid any attention to Mr. Barnstaple. It was like a meeting at a railway station. It was like a reception. It was utterly incredible and altogether commonplace. He was weary. He was saturated and exhausted by wonder. "Oh, I am going to my bed," he yawned suddenly. "I am going to my little bed." He made his way through the friendly-eyed utopians out into the calm starlight. He nodded to the strange nebula at the corner of Orion as a weary parent might nod to importunate offspring. He would consider it again in the morning. He staggered drowsily through the gardens to his own particular retreat. He disrobed and went to sleep as immediately and profoundly as a tired child. End of Section 7. Chapter the 8th. Early Morning in Utopia. Part 1. Mr. Barnstaple awakened slowly out of profound slumber. He had a vague feeling that a very delightful and wonderful dream was slipping from him. He tried to keep on with the dream and not to open his eyes. It was about a great world of beautiful people who had freed themselves from 1,000 earthly troubles. But it dissolved and faded from his mind. It was not often nowadays that dreams came to Mr. Barnstaple. He lay very still with his eyes closed, reluctantly coming awake to the affairs of every day. The cares and worries of the last fortnight resumed their sway. Would he ever be able to get away for a holiday by himself? Then he remembered that he had already got his valise stowed away in the Yellow Peril. But surely that was not last night. That was the night before last, and he had started. He remembered now starting and the little thrill of getting through the gate before Mrs. Barnstaple suspected anything. He opened his eyes and fixed them on a white ceiling, trying to recall that journey. He remembered turning into the Camberwell New Road and the bright exhilaration of the morning, Vauxhall Bridge and that nasty tangle of traffic at Hyde Park Corner. He always maintained that the west of London was far more difficult for motoring than the east. Then, had he gone to Uxbridge? No. He recalled the road to Slough, and then came a blank in his mind. What a very good ceiling this was! Not a crack nor a stain. But how had he spent the rest of the day? He must have got somewhere because he was in a thoroughly comfortable bed, an excellent bed, with a thrush singing. He had always maintained that a good thrush could knock spots off a nightingale, but this thrush was a perfect Caruso. And another answering it! In July! Pangbourne and Caversham were wonderful places for nightingales in June, but this was July, and thrushes. Across these drowsy thought phantoms came the figure of Mr. Rupert Catskill, hands on hips, face and head thrust forward, speaking, saying astonishing things. To a naked seated figure with a grave, intent face, and other figures, one with a face like the Delphic Sibyl. Mr. Barnstaple began to remember that in some way he had got himself mixed up with a week-end party at the Taplow Court. Now, had this speech been given at Taplow Court? At Taplow Court they wear clothes, but perhaps the aristocracy in retirement and privacy? Utopia. But was it possible? Mr. Barnstaple sat up in his bed in a state of extreme amazement. Impossible, he said. He was lying in a little loggia half open to the air. Between the slender pillars of fluted glass, he saw a range of snow-topped mountains, and in the forest a great cluster of tall spikes bearing deep red flowers. The bird was still singing, a glorified thrush in a glorified world. Now he remembered everything. Now it was all clear. The sudden twisting of the car, the sound like the snapping of a fiddle string, and Utopia. Now he had it all, from the sight of the sweet dead green lake to the bringing in of Lord Barralonga under the strange unfamiliar stars. It was no dream. He looked at his hand on the exquisitely fine coverlet. He felt his rough chin. It was a world real enough for shaving, and for a very definite readiness for breakfast. Very, for he had missed his supper. And as if in answer to his thought, a smiling girl appeared ascending the steps to his sleeping place and bearing a little tray. After all, there was much to be said for Mr. Burley. To his swift statesmanship it was that Mr. Barnstaple owed this morning cup of tea. "Good morning," said Mr. Barnstaple. "Why not?" said the young utopian, and put down his tea and smiled at him in a motherly fashion and departed. "Why not a good morning, I suppose?" said Mr. Barnstaple, and meditated for a moment, chin on knees, and then gave his attention to the bread and butter and tea. Part 2. The little dressing-room in which he found his clothes lying just as he had dumped them overnight was at once extraordinarily simple and extraordinarily full of interest for Mr. Barnstaple. He paddled about it, humming as he examined it. The bath was much shallower than an ordinary earthly bath. Apparently the utopians did not believe in lying down and stewing. And the forms of everything were different, simpler, and more graceful. On earth, he reflected, art was largely wit. The artist had a certain limited selection of obdurate materials and certain needs, and his work was a clever reconciliation of the obduracy and the necessity and of the idiosyncrasy of the substance to the aesthetic preconceptions of the human mind. How delightful, for example, was the earthly carpenter dealing cleverly with the grain and character of this wood or that. But here the artist had a limitless control of material, and that element of witty adaptation had gone out of his work. His data were the human mind and body. Everything in this little room was unobtrusively but perfectly convenient and difficult to misuse. If you splashed too much, a thoughtful outer rim tidied things up for you. In a tray by the bath was a very big fine sponge, so either utopians still dived for sponges, or they grew them, or trained them, who could tell, to come up of their own accord. As he set out his toilet things, a tumbler was pushed off a glass shelf onto the floor and did not break. Mr. Barnstaple, in an experimental mood, dropped it again, and still it did not break. He could not find taps at first, though there was a big washing basin as well as a bath. Then he perceived a number of studs on the walls, with black marks that might be utopian writing. He experimented. He found very hot water and then very cold water filling his bath, a fountain of probably soapy warm water, and other fluids, one with an odor of pine and one with a subdued odor of chlorine. The utopian characters on these studs set him musing for a time. They were the first writing he had seen. They appeared to be word characters, but whether they represented sounds or were greatly simplified hieroglyphics he could not imagine. Then his mind went off at a tangent in another direction, because the only metal apparent in this dressing room was gold. There was, he noted, an extraordinary lot of gold in the room. It was set and inlaid in gold. The soft yellow lines gleamed and glittered. Gold evidently was cheap in Utopia. Perhaps they knew how to make it. He roused himself to the business of his toilet. There was no looking-glass in the room, but when he tried what he thought was the handle of a cupboard door, he found himself opening a triple full-length mirror. Afterwards he was to discover that there were no displayed mirrors in Utopia. Utopians, he was to learn, thought it indecent to be reminded of themselves in that way. The utopian method was to scrutinize oneself, see that one was all right, and then forget oneself for the rest of the day. He stood now surveying his pajamaed and unshaven self with extreme disfavor. Why do respectable citizens favor such ugly pink-striped pajamas? When he unpacked his nail-brush and toothbrush, shaving-brush and washing-glove, they seemed to him to have the coarseness of popular burlesque. His toothbrush was a particularly ignoble instrument. He wished now he had bought a new one at the chemist's shop near Victoria Station. And what nasty, queer things his clothes were! He had a fantastic idea of adopting utopian ideas of costume, but a reflective moment before his mirror restrained him. Then he remembered that he had packed a silk tennis shirt and flannels. Suppose he wore those, without a collar, stud, or tie, and went barefooted. He surveyed his feet. As feet went on earth, they were not unsightly feet. But on earth they had just been wasted. Part 3. A particularly clean and radiant Mr. Barnstaple, white-clad, bare-necked and barefooted, presently emerged into the utopian sunrise. He smiled, stretched his arms, and took a deep breath of the sweet air. Then suddenly his face became hard and resolute. From another little sleeping-house not 200 yards away, Father Amerton was emerging. Intuitively, Mr. Barnstaple knew he meant either to forgive or be forgiven for the overnight quarrel. It would be a matter of chance whether he would select the role of offender or victim. What was certain was that he would smear a dreary mess of emotional personal relationship over the jewel-like clearness and brightness of the scene. A little to the right of Mr. Barnstaple and in front of him were wide steps leading down towards the lake. 3 strides, and he was going down these steps 2 at a time. It may have been his hectic fancy, but it seemed to him that he heard the voice of Father Amerton. "Mr. Barnstaple," in pursuit. Mr. Barnstaple doubled and doubled again, and crossed a bridge across an avalanche gully. A bridge with huge masonry in back and roof, and with delicate pillars of prismatic glass towards the lake. The sunlight entangled in these pillars broke into splashes of red and blue and golden light. Then, at a turfy corner gay with blue gentians, he narrowly escaped a collision with Mr. Rupert Catskill. Mr. Catskill was in the same costume that he had worn on the previous day, except that he was without his grey top hat. He walked with his hands clasped behind him. "Hello," he said. "What's the hurry? We seem to be the first people up." "I saw Father Amerton." "That accounts for it. You were afraid of being caught up in a service, matins or prime or whatever he calls it. Wise man to run. He shall pray for the lot of us. Me too." He did not wait for any endorsement from Mr. Barnstaple, but went on talking. "You have slept well? What did you think of the old fellow's answer to my speech, eh? Evasive cliches. When in doubt, abuse the plaintiff's attorney. We don't agree with him because we have bad hearts." "What old fellow do you mean?" "The worthy gentleman who spoke after me." "Uthred? But he's not 40. He's 73. He told us afterwards. They live long here, a lingering business. Our lives are but a fitful hectic fervor from their point of view. But as Tennyson said, better 50 years of Europe than a cycle of Cathay. He evaded my points. This is Lotus Land, Sunset Land. We shan't be thanked for disturbing its slumbers." "I doubt their slumbers." "Perhaps the socialist bug has bit you too." "Yes, I see it has. Believe me, this has the most complete demonstration of decadence it would be possible to imagine. Complete. And we shall disturb their slumbers, never fear. Nature, you will see, is on our side, in a way no one has thought of yet." "But I don't see the decadence," said Mr. Barnstaple. "None so blind as those who won't see. It's everywhere. Their large, flush pseudo-health, like fatted cattle, and their treatment of Baralonga. They don't know how to treat him. They don't even arrest him. They've never arrested anyone for 1,000 years. He careers through their land, killing and slaying and frightening and disturbing, and they're flabbergasted. Sir, simply flabbergasted. It's like a dog running amok in a world full of sheep. If he hadn't had a side slip, I believe he would be hooting and snorting and careering along now, killing people. They've lost the instinct of social defense." "I wonder." "A very good attitude of mind, if indulged in moderation. But when your wondering is over, you will begin to see that I am right, Ah, there on that terrace. Isn't that my Lord Baralonga and his French acquaintance?" "It is, inhaling the morning air. I think with your permission I will go and have a word with them. Which way did you say Father Amerton was? I don't want to disturb his devotions. This way? Then if I go to the right—" He grimaced amiably over his shoulder. Part 4. Mr. Barnstaple came upon 2 utopians gardening. They had 2 light silvery wheelbarrows, and they were cutting out old wood and overblown clusters from a line of thickets that sprawled over a rough-heaped ridge of rock and foamed with crimson and deep red roses. These gardeners had great leather gauntlets and aprons of tanned skin, and they carried hooks and knives. Mr. Barnstaple had never before seen such roses as they were tending here. Their fragrance filled the air. He did not know that double roses could be got on mountains. Bright red single sorts he had seen high up in Switzerland, but not such huge flowered monsters as these. They dwarfed their leaves. Their wood was in long, thorny, snaky red-streaked stems that writhed wide and climbed to the rocky lumps over which they grew. Their great petals fell like red snow and like drifting moths, and like blood upon the soft soil that sheltered amidst the brown rocks. "You are the first utopians I've actually seen at work," he said. "This isn't our work," smiled the nearer of the 2, a fair-haired, freckled, blue-eyed youth. "But as we are for these roses, we have to keep them in order." "Are they your roses?" "Many people think these double mountain roses too much trouble and a nuisance with their thorns and sprawling branches. And many people think only the single sorts of roses ought to be grown in these high places, and that this lovely sort ought to be left to die out up here. Are you for our roses?" "Such roses as these?" said Mr. Barnstaple. "Altogether." "Good. Then just bring me up my barrow closer for all this litter. We're responsible for the good behavior of all this thicket reaching right down there almost to the water. And you have to see to it yourselves? Who else? But couldn't you get someone? Pay someone to see to it for you? Oh, hoary relic from an ancient past, the young man replied. Oh, fossil ignoramus from a barbaric universe. Don't you realize there is no working class in Utopia? It died out 1,500 years or so ago. Wages, slavery, pimping, and so forth are done with. We read about them in books. Who loves the rose must serve the rose, himself. But you work. Not for wages. Not because anyone else loves or desires something else and is too lazy to serve it or get it himself. We work part for the brain, part for the will of Utopia. May I ask at what? I explore the interior of our planet. I study high-pressure chemistry, and my friend— He interrogated his friend, whose dark face and brown eyes appeared suddenly over a foam of blossom. I do food. A cook. Of sorts. Just now I am seeing to your earthling dietary. It's most interesting and curious, but I should think it rather destructive. I plan your meals. I see you look anxious, but I saw to your breakfast last night. He glanced at a minute wristwatch under the gauntlet of his gardening glove. It will be ready in about an hour. How was the early tea? Excellent, said Mr. Barnstaple. Good, said the dark young man. I did my best. I hope the breakfast will be as satisfactory. I had to fly 200 kilometers for a pig last night and kill it and cut it up myself and find out how to cure it. Eating bacon has gone out of fashion in Utopia. I hope you will find my rashers satisfactory. It seems very rapid curing for a rasher, said Mr. Barnstaple. We could have done without it. Your spokesman made such a point of it. The fair young man struggled out of the thicket and wheeled his barrow away. Mr. Barnstaple wished the dark young man good morning. Why shouldn't it be? Asked the dark young man. Part 5. He discovered Ridley and Penk approaching him. Ridley's face and ear were still adorned with sticking plaster, and his bearing was eager and anxious. Penk followed a little way behind him, holding one hand to the side of his face. Both were in their professional dress, white-top caps, square-cut leather coats, and black gaiters. They had made no concessions to utopian laxity. Ridley began to speak as soon as he judged Mr. Barnstaple was within earshot. You don't happen to know, mister, where these decadents shoved our car? I thought your car was all smashed up. Not a Rolls-Royce, not like that. Windscreen, mudguards, and the on footboard, perhaps. We went over sideways. I want to have a look at it. And I didn't turn the petrol off. The carburetor was leaking a bit. My fault. I hadn't been careful enough with the strainer. If she runs out of petrol, where's one to get more of it in this blasted Elysium? I ain't seen a sign anywhere. I know if I don't get that car into running order before Lord Baralonga wants it, there's going to be trouble. Mr. Barnstaple had no idea where the cars were. Haven't you a car of your own? Asked Ridley reproachfully. I have, but I've never given it a thought since I got out of it. Own a driver, said Ridley bitterly. Anyhow, I can't help you find your cars. Have you asked any of the Utopians? Not us. We don't like the style of 'em, said Ridley. They'll tell you. And watch us? Whatever we do to our cars. They don't get a chance of looking into a Rolls-Royce every day in the year. Next thing we shall have them driving off in 'em. I don't like the place, and I don't like these people. They're queer. They ain't decent. His lordship says they're a lot of degenerates, and it seems to me his lordship is about right. I ain't a Puritan, but all this running about without clothes is a bit too thick for me. I wish we knew where they'd stowed those cars. Mr. Barnstaple was considering Penk. You haven't hurt your face? He asked. Nothing to speak of, said Penk. I suppose we ought to be getting on. Ridley looked at Penk, and then at Mr. Barnstaple. He's had a bit of a contusion, he remarked, a faint smile breaking through his sourness. We better be getting on if we're going to find those cars, said Penk. A grin of intense enjoyment appeared upon Ridley's face. He's bumped against something. Oh, shut it, said Penk. But the thing was too good to keep back. One of these girls hit him." "What do you mean?" said Mr. Barnstaple. "You haven't been taking liberties." "I have not," said Penk. "But as Mr. Ridley's been so obliging as to start the topic, I suppose I've got to tell what happened. It just illustrates the uncertainties of being among a lot of half-savage, half-crazy people like we got among." Ridley smiled and winked at Mr. Barnstaple. "Regular hard clout she gave him. Knocked him over. He put his hand on her shoulder and clop, over he went. Never saw anything like it." "Rather unfortunate," said Mr. Barnstaple. "It all happened as second-like." "It's a pity it happened." "Don't you go making any mistake about it, mister, and don't go running off with any false ideas about it," said Penk. "I don't want the story to get about. It might do me a lot of harm with Mr. Burley. Pity Mr. Ridley couldn't hold his tongue. What provoked her I do not know. She came into me room as I was getting up, and she wasn't what you might call wearing anything. She looked a bit saucy, in my way of thinking. And, well, something came into me head, and I said to her something. Well, just the least little bit sporty, so to speak. One can't always control one's thoughts, can one? A man's a man. If a man is expected to be civil in his private thoughts to girls without a stitch, that so to speak, well, I don't know. I really do not know. It's against nature. I never said it, whatever it was I thought of. Mr. Ridley here will bear me out. I never said a word to her. I had opened my lips when she hit me. Knocked me over, she did, like a ninepin. Didn't even seem angry about it. And hook it sideways. Was a surprise as much to me as anything floored me." "But Ridley says you touched her." "Laid me out on her shoulder, perhaps, in a sort of fatherly way, as she was turning to go, not being sure whether I wasn't going to speak to her, I admit. And there you are. If I'm to get into trouble because I was wantonly hit—" Penk conveyed despair of the world by an eloquent gesture. Mr. Barnstaple considered. "I shan't make any trouble," he said. "But all the same, I think we must all be very careful with these utopians. Their ways are not our ways." "Thank God," said Ridley. "The sooner I get out of this world and back to old England, the better I shall like it." He turned to go. "You should hear his lordship," said Ridley over his shoulder. "He says it's just a world of bally degenerates, rotten degenerates. In fact, if you excuse me, horrible, bloody awful degenerates, eh? That about gets him." "The young woman's arm doesn't seem to have been very degenerate," said Mr. Barnstaple, standing the shock bravely. "Don't it?" said Ridley bitterly. "That's all you know. Why, if there's one sign more sure than another about degeneration, it's when women take to knocking men about. It's against instinct. In any respectable, decent world, such a thing couldn't possibly have happened. Nohow." "Nohow," echoed Penk. "In our world, such a girl would jolly soon have a lesson. Jolly soon, see?" But Mr. Barnstaple's roving eye had suddenly discovered Father Amerton approaching very rapidly across a wide space of lawn and making arresting gestures. Mr. Barnstaple perceived he must act at once. "Now here's someone who will certainly be able to help you find your cars, if he cares to do so. He's a most helpful man, Father Amerton, and the sort of views he has about women are the sort of views you have. You are bound to get on together. If you will stop him and put the whole case to him, plainly and clearly." He set off at a brisk pace toward the lake shore. He could not be far now from the little summer-house that ran over the water against which the gaily colored boats were moored. If he were to get into one of these and pull out into the lake, he would have Father Amerton at a very serious disadvantage, even if that good man followed suit. One cannot have a really eloquent emotional scene when one is pulling hard in pursuit of another boat. Part 6. As Mr. Barnstaple untied the bright white canoe with the big blue eye painted at its prow that he had chosen, Lady Stella appeared on the landing stage. She came out of the pavilion that stood over the water, and something in her quick movement as she emerged suggested to Mr. Barnstable's mind that she had been hiding there. She glanced about her and spoke very eagerly. "Are you going to row out upon the lake, Mr. Barnstable? May I come?" She was attired, he noted, in a compromise between the earthly and the utopian style. She was wearing what might have been either a very simple custard-colored tea robe or a very sophisticated bath wrap. It left her slender, pretty arms bare and free except for a bracelet of amber and gold, and on her bare feet, and they were unusually shapely feet, were sandals. Her head was bare, and her dark hair very simply done, with a little black and gold fillet round it that suited her intelligent face. Mr. Barnstaple was an ignoramus about feminine costume, but he appreciated the fact that she had been clever in catching the utopian notes. He helped her into the canoe. "We will paddle right out, a good way," she said with another glance over her shoulder, and sat down. For a time Mr. Barnstaple paddled straight out so that he had nothing before him but sunlit water and sky, the low hills that closed in the lake towards the great plain, the huge pillars of the distant dam, and Lady Stella. She affected to be overcome by the beauty of the conference garden slope with its houses and terraces behind him, but he could see that she was not really looking at the scene as a whole, but searching it restlessly for some particular object or person. She made conversational efforts on the loveliness of the morning and on the fact that the birds were singing in July. "But here it is not necessarily July," said Mr. Barnstaple. "How stupid of me! Of course not. We seem to be in a fine May. It is probably very early," she said. "I forgot to wind my watch." "Oddly enough, we seem to be at about the same hours in our two worlds," said Mr. Barnstaple. "My wristwatch says 7. "No," said Lady Stella, answering her own thoughts and with her eyes on the distant gardens. "This is a utopian girl. Have you met any others of our party this morning?" Mr. Barnstaple brought the canoe round so that he too could look at the shore. From here they could see how perfectly the huge terraces and avalanche walls and gullies mingled and interwove with the projecting ribs and cliffs of the mountain masses behind. The shrub tangles passed up into hanging pine woods. The torrents and cascades from the snowfield above were caught and distributed amidst the emerald slopes and gardens of the conference park. The terraces that retained the soil and held the whole design spread out on either hand to a great distance and were continued up into the mountain substance. They were built of a material that ranged through a wide variety of colors, from a deep red to a purple-veined white, and they were diversified by great arches over torrents and rock gullies, by huge round openings that sprouted water, and by cascades of steps. The buildings of the place were distributed over these terraces and over the grassy slopes they contained, singly or in groups and clusters, buildings of purple and blue and white, as light and delicate as the alpine flowers about them. For some moments Mr. Barnstaple was held silent by this scene, and then he attended to Lady Stella's question. "I met Rupert Catskill and the two chauffeurs," he said, "and I saw Father Amerton and Lord Barralonga and Monsieur Dupont in the distance. I've seen nothing of Mr. Mush or Mr. Burley. Mr. Cecil won't be about for hours yet. He will lie in bed until 10 or 11. He always takes a good rest in the morning when there is any great mental exertion before him." The lady hesitated and then asked, "I suppose you haven't seen Miss Greta Gray?" "No," said Mr. Barnstaple. "I wasn't looking for our people. I was just strolling about and avoiding somebody." "The censor of manners and costumes?" "Yes. That, in fact, is why I took this canoe." The lady reflected and decided on a confidence. "I was running away from someone, too." "Not the preacher?" "Miss Gray." Lady Stella apparently went off at a tangent. "This is going to be a very difficult world to stay in. These people have very delicate taste. We may easily offend them." "They are intelligent enough to understand." "Do people who understand necessarily forgive? I've always doubted that proverb." Mr. Barnstaple did not wish the conversation to drift away into generalities, so he paddled and said nothing. "You see, Miss Gray used to play Phryne in a revue." "I seem to remember something about it. There was a fuss in the newspapers. That perhaps gave her a bias." 3 long sweeps with the paddle. "But this morning she came to me and told me that she was going to wear complete utopian costume." "Meaning?" "A little rouge and face powder. It doesn't suit her the least little bit, Mr. Barnstaple. It's a faux pas. It's indecent. But she's running about the gardens. She might meet anyone. It's lucky Mr. Cecil isn't up. If she meets Father Amerton... But it's best not to think of that. You see, Mr. Barnstaple, these utopians and their sun-browned bodies and everything are in the picture. They don't embarrass me. But Miss Grey, an earthly, civilized woman taken out of her clothes, looks taken out of her clothes, peeled, a sort of bleached white. That nice woman who seems to hover around us, likeness, when she advised me what to wear, never for one moment suggested anything of the sort. But of course I don't know Miss Grey well enough to talk to her, and besides, one never knows how a woman of that sort is going to take a thing. Mr. Barnstaple stared shoreward. Nothing was to be seen of an excessively visible Miss Greta Grey. Then he had a conviction. "Likeness will take care of her," he said. "I hope she will. Perhaps if we stay out here for a time." "She will be looked after," said Mr. Barnstaple. "But I think Miss Grey and Lord Barralonga's party generally are going to make trouble for us. I wish they hadn't come through with us." "Mr. Cecil thinks that," said Lady Stella. "Naturally, we shall all be thrown very much together and judged in a lump." "Naturally," Lady Stella echoed. She said no more for a little while, but it was evident that she had more to say. Mr. Barnstaple paddled slowly. "Mr. Barnstaple," she began presently. Mr. Barnstaple's paddle became still. "Mr. Barnstaple, are you afraid?" Mr. Barnstaple judged himself. "I have been too full of wonder to be afraid." Lady Stella decided to confess. "I am afraid," she said. "It wasn't at first. Everything seemed to go so easily and simply. But in the night I woke up horribly afraid." "No," considered Mr. Barnstaple. "No, it hasn't taken me like that yet. Perhaps it will." Lady Stella leaned forward and spoke confidently, watching the effect of her words on Mr. Barnstaple. "These utopians, I thought at first they were just simple, healthy human beings, artistic and innocent. But they are not, Mr. Barnstaple. There is something hard and complicated about them, something that goes beyond us that we don't understand. And they don't care for us. They look at us with heartless eyes. Likeness is kind, but hardly any of the others are the least bit kind. And I think they find us inconvenient." Mr. Barnstaple thought it over. "Perhaps they do. I have been so preoccupied with admiration, so much of this is fine beyond dreaming, that I have not thought very much of how we affected them. But yes, they seem to be busy about other things, and not very attentive to us, except the ones who have evidently been assigned to watch and study us. And Lord Barralonga's headlong rush through the country must certainly have been inconvenient." "He killed a man." "I know." They remained thoughtfully silent for some moments. "And there are other things," Lady Stella resumed. "They think quite differently from our way of thinking. I believe they despise us already. I noted something. Last evening you were not with us by the lake when Mr. Cecil asked them about their philosophy. He told them things about Hegel and Bergson and Lord Halden and his own wonderful skepticism. He opened out unusually. It was very interesting to me. But I was watching Uhtred and Leon, and in the midst of it I am convinced, that they were talking to each other in that silent way they have, about something quite different. They were just shamming attention. And when Freddie Mush tried to interest them in some Neo-Georgian poetry and the effect of war upon literature, and how he hoped that they had something half as beautiful as the Iliad and Utopia, though he confessed he couldn't believe that they had, they didn't even pretend to listen. They did not answer him at all. Our minds don't matter a bit to them. In these subjects, they are 3,000 years further on, but we might be interesting as learners. Would it have been interesting to have taken a Hottentot about London explaining things to him, after one had gotten over the first fun of showing off his ignorance? Perhaps it would, but I don't think they would want us here very much, and I don't think they're going to like us very much, and I don't know what they are likely to do to us if we give too much trouble, and so I am afraid." She broke out in a new place. "In the night I was reminded of my sister Mrs. Kelling's monkeys. It's a mania with her, They run about the gardens and come into the house, and the poor things are always in trouble. They don't quite know what they may do and what they may not do. They all look frightfully worried, and they get slapped and carried to the door and thrown out and all sorts of things like that. They spoil things and make her guests uneasy. You never seem to know what a monkey's going to do. And everybody hates to have them about, except my sister. And she keeps on scolding them. Come down, Jacko. Put that down, Sadie. Mr. Barnstaple laughed. It isn't going to be quite so bad as that with us, Lady Stella. We are not monkeys. She laughed too. Oh, perhaps it isn't. But all the same, in the night, I felt it might be. We are inferior creatures. One has to admit it. She knitted her brows. Her pretty face expressed great intellectual effort. Do you realize how we are cut off? Perhaps you will think it silly of me, Mr. Barnstaple, but last night before I went to bed I sat down to write my sister a letter and tell her about all the things while they were fresh in my mind. And suddenly I realized I might as well write to Julius Caesar. Mr. Barnstaple hadn't thought of that. That's a thing I can't get out of my head, Mr. Barnstaple. No letters, no telegrams, no newspapers, no Bradshaw in Utopia. All these things we care for really. All the people we live for, cut off. I don't know for how long, but completely cut off. How long are they likely to keep us here? Mr. Barnstaple's face became speculative. Are you sure they can never send us back? The lady asked. There seems to be some doubt, but they are astonishingly clever people. It seemed so easy coming here, just as if one had walked around a corner. But of course, properly speaking, we are out of space and time. More out of it than even dead people. The North Pole or Central Africa is a whole universe nearer home than we are. It's hard to grasp that. In this sunlight, it all seems so bright and familiar. Yet last night there were moments when I wanted to scream. She stopped short and scanned the shore. Then very deliberately she sniffed. Mr. Barnstaple became aware of a peculiarly sharp and appetizing smell drifting across the water to him. Yes, he said. It's breakfast bacon, cried Lady Stella with a squeak in her voice. Exactly as Mr. Burley told them, said Mr. Barnstaple, mechanically turning the canoe shoreward. Breakfast bacon! That's the most reassuring thing that has happened yet. Perhaps, after all of it, it was silly to feel frightened. And there they are signaling to us. She waved her arm. Greta in a white robe, as you prophesied, and Mr. Mush in a sort of toga talking to her. Where could he have got that toga? A faint sound of voices calling reached them. Coming! Cried Lady Stella. I hope I haven't been pessimistic, said Lady Stella, but I felt horrid in the night. End of section 8.
Chapter the 1st. The Epidemic. 1. The shadow of the great epidemic in Utopia fell upon our little band of Earthlings in the second day after their eruption. For more than 20 centuries, the Utopians had had the completest freedom from infectious and contagious disease of all sorts. Not only had the graver epidemic fevers and all sorts of skin diseases gone out of the lives of animals and men, but all the minor infections of colds, coughs, influenzas, and the like had also been mastered and ended. By isolation, by the control of carriers, and so forth, the fatal germs had been cornered and obliged to die out. And there had followed a corresponding change in the utopian physiology. Secretions and reactions that had given the body resisting power to infection had diminished. The energy that produced them had been withdrawn to other more serviceable applications. The utopian physiology, relieved of these merely defensive necessities, had simplified itself and become more direct and efficient. This cleaning up of infections was such ancient history in Utopia that only those who specialized in the history of pathology understood anything of the miseries mankind had suffered under from this source. And even these specialists do not seem to have had any idea of how far the race had lost its former resistance to infection. The first person to think of this lost resisting power seems to have been Mr. Rupert Catskill. Mr. Barnstaple recalled that when they had met early on the first morning of their stay in the conference gardens, he had been hinting that nature was in some unexplained way on the side of the Earthlings. If making them obnoxious was being on their side, then Certainly nature was on their side. By the evening of the second day after their arrival, nearly everybody who had been in contact with the Earthlings, with the exception of Lichness, Serpentine, and 3 or 4 others who had retained something of their ancestral antitoxins, was in a fever, with cough, sore throat, aching bones, headache, and such physical depression and misery as Utopia had not known for 20 centuries. The first inhabitant of Utopia to die was that leopard which had sniffed at Mr. Rupert Catskill on his first arrival. It was found unaccountably dead on the second morning after that encounter. In the afternoon of the same day, one of the girls who had helped Lady Stella to unpack her bags sickened suddenly and died. Utopia was even less prepared for the coming of these disease germs than for the coming of the Earthlings who brought them. The monstrous multitude of general and fever hospitals, doctors, drug shops, and so forth that had existed in the last age of confusion had long since passed out of memory. There was a surgical service for accidents, and a watch kept upon the health of the young, and there were places of rest at which those who were extremely old were assisted. But there remained scarcely anything of the hygienic organization that had formerly struggled against disease. Abruptly, the utopian intelligence had to take up again a tangle of problems long since solved and set aside, to improvise forgotten apparatus and organizations for disinfection and treatment, and to return to all the disciplines of the war against diseases that had marked an epoch in its history 20 centuries before. In one respect, indeed, that war had left Utopia with certain permanent advantages. Nearly all the insect disease carriers had been exterminated, and rats and mice and the untidier sorts of small bird had passed out of the problem of sanitation. That set very definite limits to the spread of the new infections, and to the nature of the infections that could be spread. It enabled the Earthlings only to communicate such ailments as could be breathed across an interval or conveyed by a contaminating touch. Though not one of them was ailing at all, it became clear that someone among them had brought latent measles into the utopian universe, and that 3 or 4 of them had liberated a long-suppressed influenza. Themselves too tough to suffer, they remained at the focus of these 2 epidemics, while their victims coughed and sneezed and kissed and whispered them about the utopian planet. It was not until the afternoon of the second day after the eruption that Utopia realized what had happened, and set itself to deal with this relapse into barbaric solicitudes. 2. Mr. Barnstaple was probably the last of the Earthlings to hear of the epidemic. He was away from the rest of the party upon an expedition of his own. It was early clear to him that the Utopians did not intend to devote any considerable amount of time or energy to the edification of their Earthling visitors. After the éclaircissement of the afternoon of the eruption, there were no further attempts to lecture to the visitors upon the constitution and methods of Utopia, and only some very brief questioning upon the earthly state of affairs. The Earthlings were left very much together to talk things out among themselves. Several Utopians were evidently entrusted with their comfort and well-being, but they did not seem to think that their functions extended to edification. Mr. Barnstaple found much to irritate him in the ideas and comments of several of his associates, and so he obeyed his natural inclination to explore Utopia for himself. There was something that stirred his imagination in the vast plain below the lake that he had glimpsed before his aeroplane descended into the valley of the Conference, and on his second morning he had taken a little boat and rowed out across the lake to examine the dam that retained its waters and to get a view of the great plain from the parapet of the dam. The lake was much wider than he had thought it, and the dam much larger. The water was crystalline clear and very cold, and there were but few fish in it. He had come out immediately after his breakfast, but it was near midday before he had got to the parapet of the great dam, and could look down the lower valley to the great plain. The dam was built of huge blocks of red and gold-veined rock, but steps at intervals gave access to the roadway along its crest. The great seated figures which brooded over the distant plain had been put there, it would seem, in a mood of artistic lightheartedness. They sat as if they watched or thought. Vast, rude shapes, half mountainous, half human. Mr. Barnstaple guessed them to be perhaps 200 feet high. By pacing the distance between 2 of them, and afterwards counting the number of them, he came to the conclusion that the dam was between 7 and 10 miles long. On the far side it dropped sheerly for perhaps 500 feet, and it was sustained by a series of enormous buttresses that passed almost insensibly into native rock. In the bays between these buttresses hummed great batteries of water turbines, and then, its first task done, the water dropped foaming and disheveled and gathered in another broad lake retained by a second great dam 2 miles or so away, and perhaps 1,000 feet lower. Far away was a third lake and a third dam, and then the plain. Only 3 or 4 minute-looking Utopians were visible amidst all this titanic engineering. Mr. Barnstaple stood, the smallest of objects, in the shadow of a brooding colossus and peered over these nearer things at the hazy levels of the plain beyond. What sort of life was going on there? The relationship of plain to mountain reminded him very strongly of the Alps and the great plain of northern Italy, down into which he had walked as the climax of many a summer holiday in his youth. In Italy, he knew that those distant levels would be covered with clustering towns and villages, and carefully irrigated and closely cultivated fields. A dense population would be toiling with an ant-like industry in the production of food, forever increasing its numbers until those inevitable consequences of overcrowding, disease, and pestilence established a sort of balance between the area of the land and the number of families scraping at it for nourishment. As a toiling man can grow more food than he can actually eat, and as virtuous women can bear more children than the land can possibly employ, a surplus of landless population would be gathered in Wen-like towns and cities, engaged there in legal and financial operations against the agriculturalist, or in the manufacture of just plausible articles for sale. 99 out of every 100 of this population would be concentrated from childhood to old age upon the difficult task which is known as getting a living. Amidst it, sustained by a pretense of magical propitiations, would rise shrines and temples, supporting a parasitic host of priests and monks and nuns. Eating and breeding, the simple routines of the common life since human societies began. Complications of food getting, elaborations of acquisitiveness and a tribute paid to fear. Such would be the spectacle that any warm and fertile stretch of earth would still display. There would be gleams of laughter and humor there, brief interludes of holiday, flashes of youth before its extinction in adult toil, but a driven labor, the spite and hates of overcrowding, the eternal uncertainty of destitution would dominate the scene. Decrepitude would come by 60. Women would be old and worn out by 40. But this utopian plain below, sunlit and fertile though it was under another law. Here that common life of mankind, its ancient traditions, its hoary jests and tales repeated generation after generation, its seasonal festivals, its pious fears and spasmodic indulgences, its limited yet incessant and pitifully childish hoping, and its abounding misery and tragic futility, had come to an end. It had passed forever out of this older world. That high tide of common living had receded and vanished while the soil was still productive and the sun still shone. It was with something like awe that Mr. Barnstaple realized how clean a sweep had been made of the common life in a mere score of centuries, how boldly and dreadfully the mind of man had taken hold, soul and body and destiny, of the life and destiny of the race. He knew himself now for the creature of transition he was, so deep in the habits of the old, so sympathetic with the idea of the new that has still but scarcely dawned on earth. For long he had known how intensely he loathed and despised that reeking peasant life which is our past. He realized now for the first time how profoundly he feared the high, austere utopian life which lies before us. This world he looked out upon seemed very clean and dreadful to him. What were they doing upon those distant plains? What daily life did they lead there? He knew enough of utopia now to know that the whole land would be like a garden, with every natural tendency to beauty seized upon and developed, and every innate ugliness corrected and overcome. These people could work and struggle for loveliness, he knew, for his 2 rose growers had taught him as much. And to and fro the food folk and the housing people and those who ordered the general life went, keeping the economic machine running so smoothly that one heard nothing of the jangling and jarring and internal breakages that constitute the dominant melody in our Earth's affairs. The ages of economic disputes and experiments had come to an end. The right way to do things had been found, and the population of this utopia, which had shrunken at one time to only 200 million, was now increasing again to keep pace with the constant increase in human resources. Having freed itself from 1,000 evils that would otherwise have grown with its growth, the race could grow indeed. And down there under the blue haze of the great plain, almost all those who were not engaged in the affairs of food and architecture, health, education, and the correlation of activities, were busied upon creative work. They were continually exploring the world without, or the world within, through scientific research and artistic creation. They were continually adding to their collective power over life, or to the realized worth of life. Mr. Barnstaple was accustomed to think of our own world as a wild rush of inventions and knowledge, but all the progress of Earth for 100 years could not compare, he knew, with the forward swing of these millions of associated intelligences in one single year. Knowledge swept forward here, and darkness passed as the shadow of a cloud passes on a windy day. Down there, they were assaying the minerals that lie in the heart of their planet and weaving a web to capture the sun and the stars. Life marched here. It was terrifying to think with what strides. Terrifying, because at the back of Mr. Barnstaple's mind, as at the back of so many intelligent minds in our world still, had been the persuasion that presently everything would be known and the scientific process come to an end, and then we should be happy forever after. He was not really acclimated to progress. He had always thought of utopia as a tranquility with everything settled for good. Even today it seemed tranquil under that level haze, but he knew that this quiet was the steadiness of a mill race, which seems almost motionless in its quiet onrush until a bubble or a fleck of foam or some stick or leaf shoots along it and reveals its velocity. And how did it feel to be living in utopia? The lives of the people must be like the lives of very successful artists or scientific workers in this world. A continual refreshing discovery of new things, a constant adventure into the unknown and untried. For recreation they went about their planet, and there was much love and laughter and friendship in utopia, and an abundant, easy, informal social life. Games that did not involve bodily exercise, those substitutes of the half-witted for research and mental effort, had gone entirely out of life. But many active games were played for the sake of fun and bodily vigor. It must be a good life for those who had been educated to live it, indeed, a most enviable life. And pervading it all must be the happy sense that it mattered. It went on to endless consequences. And they loved, no doubt, subtly and deliciously, but perhaps a little hardly. Perhaps in those distant plains there was not much pity or tenderness. Bright and lovely beings they were, in no way pitiful. There would be no need for those qualities. Yet the woman, Lichness, looked kind. Did they keep faith or need to keep faith as earthly lovers do? What was love like in utopia? Lovers still whispered in the dusk. What was the essence of love? A preference? A sweet pride? A delightful gift won? The most exquisite reassurance of body and mind? What could it be like to love and be loved by one of these utopian women? To have her glowing face close to one's own? To be quickened into life by her kiss? Mr. Barnstaple sat in his flannels, barefooted, in the shadow of a stone colossus. He felt like some minute stray insect, perched upon the big dam. It seemed to him that it was impossible that this triumphant utopian race could ever fall back again from its magnificent attack upon the dominion of all things. High and tremendously this world had clamored and was still clamoring. Surely it was safe now in its attainment. Yet all this stupendous security and mastery of nature had come about in the little space of 3,000 years. The race could not have altered fundamentally in that brief interval. Essentially, it was still a Stone Age race. It was not 20,000 years away from the dangers when it knew nothing of metals and could not read or write. Deep in its nature, arrested and undeveloped, there still lay the seeds of anger and fear and dissension. There must still be many uneasy and insubordinate spirits in this utopia. Eugenics had scarcely begun here. He remembered the keen, sweet face of the young girl who had spoken to him in the starlight on the night of his arrival, and the note of romantic eagerness in her voice when she had asked if Lord Baralonga was not a very vigorous and cruel man. Did the romantic spirit still trouble imaginations here? Possibly only adolescent imaginations. Might not some great shock or some phase of confusion still be possible to this immense order? Might not its system of education become wearied by its task of discipline and fall a prey to the experimental spirit? Might not the unforeseen be still lying in wait for this race? Suppose there should prove to be an infection of Father Amerton's religious fervor, or Rupert Catskill's incurable craving for fantastic enterprises. No, it was inconceivable. The achievement of this world was too calmly great and assured. Mr. Barnstaple stood up and made his way down the steps of the great dam to where, far below, his little skiff floated like a minute flower petal upon the clear water. 3. He became aware of a considerable commotion in the conference places. There were more than 30 aeroplanes circling in the air and descending and ascending from the park, and a great number of big white vehicles were coming and going by the pass road. Also, people seemed to be moving briskly among the houses, but it was too far off to distinguish what they were doing. He stared for a time, and then got into his little boat. He could not watch what was going on as he returned across the lake because his back was towards the slopes. But once an aeroplane came down very close to him, and he saw its occupant looking at him as he rode. And once, when he rested from rowing and sat around to look, he saw what he thought was a litter carried by two men. As he drew near the shore, a boat put off to meet him. He was astonished to see that its occupants were wearing what looked like helmets of glass with white pointed visors. He was enormously astonished and puzzled. As they approached, their message resonated into his mind. Quarantine. You have to go into quarantine. You Earthlings have started an epidemic, and it is necessary to put you into quarantine. Then these glass helmets must be a sort of gas mask. When they came alongside him, he saw that this was so. They were made of highly flexible and perfectly translucent material. 4. Mr. Barnstaple was taken past some sleeping loggias where utopians were lying in beds, while others who wore gas masks waited upon them. He found that all the Earthlings and all their possessions, except their cars, were assembled in the hall of the first day's conference. He was told that the whole party were to be removed to a new place where they could be isolated and treated. The only utopians with the party were two who wore gas masks and lounged in the open portico in attitudes disagreeably suggestive of sentries or custodians. The Earthlings sat about in little groups among the seats, except for Mr. Rupert Catskill, who was walking up and down in the apse, talking. He was hatless, flushed, and excited, with his hair in some disorder. "It's what I foresaw would happen all along," he repeated. "Didn't I tell you nature was on our side? Didn't I say it?" Mr. Burleigh was shocked and argumentative. "For the life of me, I can't see the logic of it," he declared. "Here we are, absolutely the only perfectly immune people here, and we are to be isolated." "They say they catch things from us," said Lady Stella. "Very well," said Mr. Burleigh, making his point with his long white hand. "Very well, then let them be isolated. This is Chinese. This is topsy-turvy. I'm disappointed in them." "I suppose it's their world," said Mr. Hunker, "and we've got to do things their way." Mr. Catskill concentrated upon Lord Baralonga and the two chauffeurs. "I welcome this treatment. I welcome it." "What's your idea, Rupert?" said his lordship. "We lose our freedom of action." "Not at all," said Mr. Catskill. "Not at all. We gain it. We are to be isolated. We are to be put by ourselves in some island or mountain. Well and good, well and good. This is only the beginning of our adventures. We shall see what we shall see." "But how?" "Wait a little, until we can speak more freely. These are panic measures. This pestilence is only in its opening stage. Everything is just beginning, trust me." Mr. Barnstaple sat sulkily by his valise, avoiding the challenge of Mr. Catskill's eye. End of chapter.
Book 2, Chapter 2. The Castle on the Crag, Section 1. The quarantine place to which the Earthlings were taken must have been at a very considerable distance from the place of the conference, because they were nearly 6 hours upon their journey, and all the time they were flying high and very swiftly. They were all together in one flying ship. It was roomy and comfortable, and could have held perhaps 4 times as many passengers. They were accompanied by about 30 utopians in gas masks, among whom were 2 women. The aviators wore dresses of a white fleecy substance that aroused the interest and envy of both Miss Grey and Lady Stella. The flying ship passed down the valley and over the great plain and across a narrow sea, and another land with a rocky coast and dense forests, and across a great space of empty sea. There was scarcely any shipping to be seen upon the sea at all. It seemed to Mr. Barnstaple that no earthly ocean would be so untraveled. Only once or twice did he see very big drifting vessels, quite unlike any earthly ships. Huge rafts or platforms they seemed to be, rather than ships, and once or twice he saw what was evidently a cargo boat, one with rigged masts and sails, and the air was hardly more frequented. After he was out of sight of land, he saw only 3 aeroplanes until the final landfall. They crossed a rather thickly inhabited, very delightful-looking coastal belt, and came over what was evidently a rainless desert country, given over to mining and to vast engineering operations. Far away were very high snowy mountains, but the aeroplane descended before it came to these. For a time the Earthlings were flying over enormous heaps of slaggy accumulations, great mountains of them, that seemed to be derived from a huge well-like excavation that went down into the earth to an unknown depth. A tremendous thunder of machinery came out of this pit, and much smoke. Here there were crowds of workers, and they seemed to be living in camps among the debris. Evidently the workers came to this place merely for spells of work. There were no signs of homes. The aeroplane of the Earthlings skirted this region and flew on over a rocky and almost treeless desert, deeply cut by steep gorges of the canyon type. Few people were to be seen, but there were abundant signs of engineering activity. Every torrent, every cataract was working a turbine, and great cables followed the cliffs of the gorges and were carried across the desert places. In the wider places of the gorges there were pine woods and a fairly abundant vegetation. The high crag which was their destination stood out, an almost completely isolated headland, in the fork between two convergent canyons. It towered up to a height of perhaps 2,000 feet above the foaming clash of the torrents below. A great mass of pale greenish and purple rocks, jagged and buttressed and cleft deeply by joint planes and white crystalline veins. The gorge on one side of it was much steeper than that on the other. It was so overhung indeed as to be darkened like a tunnel, and here within 100 feet or so of the brow a slender metallic bridge had been flung across the gulf. Some yards above it were projections that might have been the remains of an earlier bridge of stone. Behind, the crag fell steeply for some hundreds of feet to a long slope covered with a sparse vegetation which rose again to the main masses of the mountain, a wall of cliffs with a level top. It was on this slope that the aeroplane came down alongside of 3 or 4 smaller machines. The crag was surmounted by the tall ruins of an ancient castle, within the circle of whose walls clustered a number of buildings which had recently harbored a group of chemical students. Their researches, which had been upon some question of atomic structure, quite incomprehensible to Mr. Barnstaple, were finished now, and the place had become vacant. Their laboratory was still stocked with apparatus and material, and water and power were supplied to it from higher up the gorge by means of pipes and cables. There was also an abundant store of provisions. A number of utopians were busily adapting the place to its new purpose of isolation and disinfection when the Earthlings arrived. Serpentine appeared in the company of a man in a gas mask whose name was Cedar. This Cedar was a cytologist, and he was in charge of the arrangements for this improvised sanatorium. Serpentine explained that he himself had flown to the crag in advance, because he understood the equipment of the place and the research that had been going on there, and because his knowledge of the Earthlings and his comparative immunity to their infections made him able to act as an intermediary between them and the medical men who would now take charge of their case. He made these explanations to Mr. Burleigh, Mr. Barnstaple, Lord Baralonga, and Mr. Hunker. The other Earthlings stood about in small groups beside the aeroplane from which they had alighted, regarding the castellated summit of the crag, the scrubby bushes of the bleak upland about them, and the towering clefts of the adjacent canyons, with no very favorable expressions. Mr. Catskill had gone apart nearly to the edge of the great canyon, was standing with his hands behind his back in an attitude almost Napoleonic, lost in thought, gazing down into those sunless depths. The roar of the unseen waters below, now loud, now nearly inaudible, quivered in the air. Miss Greetick Gray had suddenly produced a Kodak camera. She had been reminded of its existence when packing for this last journey. She was taking a snapshot of the entire party. Cedar said that he would explain the method of treatment he proposed to follow, and Lord Baralonga called Rupert to bring Mr. Catskill into the group of Cedar's hearers. Cedar was as explicit and concise as Earthred had been. It was evident, he said, that the Earthlings were the hosts of a variety of infectious organisms which were kept in check in their bodies by immunizing counter-substances, but against which the Utopians had no defenses ready, and could hope to secure immunity only after a painful and disastrous epidemic. The only way to prevent this epidemic, devastating their whole planet, indeed, was firstly to gather together and cure all the cases affected, which was being done by converting the conference park into a big hospital, and next to take the Earthlings in hand and isolate them absolutely from the Utopians until they could be cleaned of their infections. It was, he confessed, an inhospitable thing to do to the earthlings, but it seemed the only possible thing to do, to bring them into this peculiarly high and dry desert air, and there to devise methods for their complete physical cleansing. If that was possible, it would be done, and then the earthlings would again be free to go and come as they pleased in Utopia. "But suppose it is not possible?" said Mr. Catskill abruptly. "I think it will be." "But if you fail?" Seater smiled at Serpentine. "Physical research is taking up the work in which Arden and Greenlake were foremost, and it will not be long before we are able to repeat their experiment, and then to reverse it, with us as your raw material. Not until we are fairly sure of a safe landing for you." "You mean," said Mr. Mush, who had joined the circle about Seater and Serpentine, "that you are going to send us back?" "If we cannot keep you," said Seater, smiling. "Delightful prospect," said Mr. Mush, unpleasantly, "to be shot across space in a gun, experimentally. And may I ask," came the voice of Father Amerton, "may I ask the nature of this treatment of yours, these experiments of which we are to be the guinea pigs, so to speak? Is it to be anything in the nature of vaccination?" "Injections," explained Mr. Barnstaple. "I have hardly decided yet," said Seater. "The problem raises questions this world has forgotten for ages." "I must say at once that I am a confirmed anti-vaccinationist," said Father Amerton. "Absolutely. Vaccination is an outrage on nature. If I had any doubts before I came into this world of vitiation, I have no doubts now. Not a doubt. If God had meant us to have these serums and ferments in our bodies, He would have provided more natural and dignified means of getting them there than a squirt." Seater did not discuss the point. He went on to further apologies. For a time he must ask the earthlings to keep within certain limits, to confine themselves to the crag and the slopes below it as far as the mountain cliffs. And further, it was impossible to set young people to attend to them, as had hitherto been done. They must cook for themselves and see to themselves generally. The appliances were all to be found above, upon the crest of the crag, and he and Serpentine would make any explanations that were needful. They would find there was ample provision for them. "Then are we to be left alone here?" asked Mr. Catskill. "For a time. When we have our problem clearer, we will come again and tell you what we mean to do." "Good," said Mr. Catskill. "Good." "I wish I hadn't sent my maid by train," said Lady Stella. "I have come to my last clean collar," said Monsieur Dupont, with a little humorous grimace. "It is no joke this week-end with Lord Baralonga." Lord Baralonga turned suddenly to his particular minion. "I believe that Ridley has the makings of a very good cook." "I don't mind trying my hand," said Ridley. "I've done most things, and once I used to look after a steam car. A man who can keep one of those things in order can do anything," said Mr. Pank, with unusual emotion. "I've no objection to being a temporary general utility along of Mr. Ridley. I began my career in the pantry, and I ain't ashamed to own it." "If this gentleman will show us the gadget," said Mr. Ridley, indicating Serpentine. "Exactly," said Mr. Pank. "And if all of us give as little trouble as possible," said Miss Greta, bravely. "I think we shall be able to manage," said Mr. Burleigh to Seater, "if at first you can spare us a little advice and help." Section 2. Seater and Serpentine remained with the earthlings upon Quarantine Crag till late in the afternoon. They hoped to prepare a supper and set it out in the courtyard of the castle. They departed with a promise to return on the morrow, and the earthlings watched them and their accompanying aeroplane soar up into the sky. Mr. Barnstaple was surprised to find himself distressed at their going. He had a feeling that mischief was brewing amongst his companions, and that the withdrawal of these utopians removed a check upon this mischief. He had helped Lady Stella in the preparation of an omelette. He had to carry back a dish and a frying pan to the kitchen after it was served, so that he was the last to seat himself at the supper table. He found the mischief he dreaded well afoot. Mr. Catskill had finished his supper already, and was standing with his foot upon a bench orating to the rest of the company. "I ask you, ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Catskill was saying, "I ask you, is not destiny writ large upon this day's adventure? Not for nothing was this place a fortress in ancient times. Here it is, ready to be a fortress again. A fortress, and such an adventure as will make the stories of Cortez and Pizarro pale their ineffectual fires. "My dear Rupert," cried Mr. Burleigh, "what have you got in that head of yours now?" Mr. Catskill waved two fingers dramatically. "The conquest of a world." "Good God!" cried Mr. Barnstaple. "Are you mad?" "As Clive," said Mr. Catskill, "or Sultan Baber when he marched to Panapat." "It's a tall proposition," said Mr. Hunker, who seemed to have had his mind already prepared for these suggestions, "but I'm inclined to give it a hearing. The alternative, so far as I can figure it out, is to be scoured and whitewashed inside and out, and then fired back into our own world, with a chance of hitting something hard on the way. You tell them, Mr. Catskill." "Tell them," said Lord Baralonga, who had also been prepared. "It's a gamble, I admit, but there are situations where one has to gamble, or be gambled with. I'm all for the active voice." "It's a gamble, certainly," said Mr. Catskill, "but upon this narrow peninsula, upon this square mile or so of territory, the fate, sir, of two universes awaits decision. This is no time for the faint heart and the paralyzing touch of discretion. Plan swiftly, act swiftly." "This is simply thrilling!" cried Miss Greta Gray, clasping her hands about her knees and smiling radiantly at Mr. Mush. "These people," Mr. Barnstaple interrupted, "are 3,000 years ahead of us. We are like a handful of Hottentots in a showman's van at Earl's Court, planning the conquest of London." Mr. Catskill, hands on hips, turned with extraordinary good humour upon Mr. Barnstaple. 3,000 years away from us, yes. 3,000 years ahead of us, no. That is where you and I join issue. You say these people are supermen. Supermen. I say they are degenerate men. Let me call your attention to my reasons for this belief. In spite of their beauty, their very considerable material and intellectual achievements, and so forth. Ideal people, I admit. What then? My case is that they have reached a summit and passed it, that they are going on by inertia, and that they have lost the power not only of resistance to disease, that weakness we shall develop more and more, but also of meeting strange and distressing emergencies. They are gentle, altogether too gentle. They are ineffectual. They do not know what to do. Here's Father Amerton. He disturbed that first meeting in the most insulting way. You know you did, Mr. Amerton. I'm not blaming you. You are morally sensitive, and there were things to outrage you. He was threatened, as a little boy is threatened by a feeble old woman. Something was to be done to him. Has anything been done to him? A man and a woman came and talked to me, said Father Amerton. And what did you do? Simply confuted them, lifted up my voice and confuted them. What did they say? What could they say? We all thought tremendous things were going to be done to poor Father Amerton. Well, and now take a graver case. Our friend Lord Baralonga ran amuck with his car and killed a man. Even at home they'd have endorsed your license, you know, and fined your man. But here, the thing has scarcely been mentioned since. Why? Because they do not know what to say about it or do about it. And now they have put us here and begged us to be good, until they are ready to come and try experiments upon us and inject things into us, and I don't know what. And if we submit, sir, if we submit, we lose one of our greatest powers over these people, our power of at once giving and resisting melees, and in addition, I know not what powers of initiative that may very well be associated with that physiological toughness of which we are to be robbed. They may trifle with our ductless glands. But science tells us that these very glands secrete our personalities. Mentally, morally, we shall be dissolved. If we submit, sir, if we submit. But suppose we do not submit. What then? Well, said Lord Baralonga, what then? They will not know what to do. Do not be deceived by any outward show of beauty and prosperity. These people are living, as the ancient Peruvians were living in the time of Pizarro, in an enervating dream. They have drunken the debilitating draught of socialism, and as in ancient Peru there is no health, nor power or will left in them any more. A handful of resolute men and women who can dare, may not only dare, but triumph in the face of such a world. And thus it is I lay my plans before you. "You mean to jump this entire utopian planet," said Mr. Hunker. "Big orders," said Lord Barralonga. "I mean, sir, to assert the rights of a more vigorous form of social life over a less vigorous form of social life. Here we are in a fortress. It is a real fortress, and quite defensible. While you others have been unpacking, Barralonga and Hunker and I have been seeing to that. There is the sheltered well, so that if need arises we can get water from the canyon below. The rock is excavated into chambers and shelters. The wall on the land side is sound and high, glazed so that it cannot be scaled. This great archway can easily be barricaded when the need arises. Steps go down through the rock to that little bridge which can, if necessary, be cut away. We have not yet explored all the excavations. In Mr. Hunker we have a chemist. He was a chemist before the movie picture claimed him as its master, and he says there is ample material in the laboratory for a store of bombs. This party, I can find, can muster 5 revolvers with ammunition. I scarcely dared hope for that. We have food for many days." "Oh, this is ridiculous!" cried Mr. Barnstaple, standing up and then sitting down again. "This is preposterous, to turn on these friendly people. But they can blow this little headland to smithereens whenever they want to." "Ah," said Mr. Catskill, and held him with his outstretched finger. "We've thought of that. But we can take a leaf from the book of Cortez, who in the very center of Mexico held Montezuma as his prisoner and hostage. We too will have our hostage. Before we lift a finger, first our hostage. Aerial bombs! Is there such a thing in Utopia, or such an idea? And again, we must have our hostage." "Somebody of importance," said Mr. Hunker. "Cedar and Serpentine are both important people," said Mr. Burley, in tones of disinterested observation. "But surely, sir, you do not countenance the schoolboy's dream of piracy," cried Mr. Barnstaple, sincerely shocked. "Schoolboys!" cried Father Amerton. "A cabinet minister, a peer, and a great entrepreneur." "My dear sir," said Mr. Burley, "we are, after all, only envisioning eventualities. For the life of me, I do not see why we should not thresh out these possibilities, though I pray to heaven we may never have to realize them. You were saying, Rupert? We have to establish ourselves here and assert our independence and make ourselves felt by these utopians." "'Ear, 'ear," said Mr. Ridley cordially. "1 or 2 I'd like to make feel personally. We have to turn this prison into a capital, into the first foothold of mankind in this world. It is like a foot thrust into a reluctant door that must never more close upon our race." "It is closed," said Mr. Barnstaple. "Except by the mercy of these utopians we shall never see our world again, and even with their mercy it is doubtful. That's been keeping me awake nights," said Mr. Hunker. "It's an idea that must have occurred to all of us," said Mr. Burley. "And it's an idea that's so thundering disagreeable that one hasn't cared to talk about it," said Lord Barralonga. "I never had it until this moment," said Penk. "You don't really mean to say, sir, we can't get back?" "Things will be as they will be," said Mr. Burley. "That is why I am anxious to hear Mr. Catskill's ideas." Mr. Catskill rested his hands on his hips, and his manner became very solemn. "For once," he said, "I am in agreement with Mr. Barnaby. I believe that the chances are against our ever seeing the dear cities of our world again." "I felt that," said Lady Stella, with white lips. "I knew that 2 days ago." "And so behold my week end expand to an eternity," said Monsieur Dupont, and for a long time no one said another word. "It's as if," Pank said at last, "why, one might be dead." "But I must be back," Miss Greetockay broke out abruptly, as one who sets aside a foolish idea. "It's absurd. I have to go on at the Alhambra on September the 2nd. It's imperative. We came here quite easily. It's ridiculous to say I can't go back in the same way." Lord Barralonga regarded her with affectionate malignity. "You wait," he said. "But I must," she sang. "There are such things as impossibilities, even for Miss Greta Gray." "Charter a special aeroplane," she said. "Anything." He regarded her with an elfin grin, and shook his head. "My dear man," she said, "you've only seen me in a holiday mood so far. Work is serious. My dear girl, that Alhambra of yours is about as far from us now as the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. It can't be done." "But it must," she said, in her queenly way, "and that's all about it. Section 3. Mr. Barnstaple got up from the table and walked apart to where a gap in the castle wall gave upon the darkling wilderness without. He sat down there. His eyes went from the little group talking around the supper table to the sunlit crest of the cliffs across the canyon and to the wild and lonely mountain slopes below the headland. In this world he might have to live out the remainder of his days, and those days might not be very numerous if Mr. Catskill had his way. Sydenham and his wife and the boys were indeed as far as the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. He had scarcely given his family a thought since he had posted his letter at Victoria. Now he felt a queer twinge of desire to send them some word or token, if only he could. Queer that they would never hear from him or of him again. How would they get on without him? Would there be any difficulty about the account at the bank, or about the insurance money? He had always intended to have a joint and several account with his wife at the bank, and he never quite liked to do it. Joint and several. Thing every man ought to do. His attention came back to Mr. Catskill unfolding his plans. We have to make up our minds to what may be a very prolonged stay here. Do not let us deceive ourselves upon that score. It may last for years. It may last for generations. Something struck Penck in that. "I don't hardly see," he said, "how that can be. Generations?" "I'm coming to that," said Mr. Catskill. "Unhappily," said Mr. Penck, and became profoundly restrained and thoughtful with his eyes on Lady Stella. "We have to remain a little alien community in this world until we dominate it, as the Romans dominated the Greeks, and until we master its science and subdue it to our purpose. That may mean a long struggle, may mean a very long struggle indeed, and meanwhile we must maintain ourselves as a community. We must consider ourselves a colony, a garrison, until that day of reunion comes. We must hold our hostages, sir, and not only our hostages. May be necessary for our purpose, and if it is necessary for our purpose, so be it, to get in others of these utopians, to catch them young, before this so-called education of theirs unfits them for our purpose, to train them in the great traditions of our empire and our race." Mr. Hunker seemed on the point of saying something, but refrained. Monsieur Dupont got up sharply from the table, walked 4 paces away, returned and stood still, watching Mr. Catskill. "Generations?" said Mr. Penck. "Yes," said Mr. Catskill, "generations. For here we are strangers. Strangers like that other little band of adventurers who established their citadel 25 centuries ago upon the Capitol beside the Russian Tiber. This is our capital, a greater capital of a greater Rome in a vaster world, and like that band of Roman adventurers, we too may have to reinforce our scanty numbers at the expense of the Sabines about us, and take to ourselves servants and helpers and mates. No sacrifice is too great for the high possibility of this adventure." Monsieur Dupont seemed to nerve himself for the sacrifice. "Duly married," injected Father Amerton. "Duly married," said Mr. Catskill in parentheses. "And so, sir, we will hold out here and maintain ourselves and dominate this desert countryside, and spread our prestige and our influence and our spirit into the inert body of this decadent utopian world, until at last we are able to master the secret that Arden and Greenlake were seeking, and recover the way back to our own people, opening to the crowded millions of our empire." Section 4. "Just a moment," said Mr. Hunker. "Just a moment. About this empire." "Exactly," said Monsieur Dupont, recalled abruptly from some romantic daydream. "About your empire." Mr. Catskill regarded them thoughtfully and defensively. "When I say empire, I mean it in the most general sense." "Exactly," snapped Monsieur Dupont. "I was thinking generally of our Atlantic civilization." "Before, sir, you go on to talk of Anglo-Saxon unity and the English-speaking race," said Monsieur Dupont, with a rising note of bitterness in his voice, "permit me to remind you, sir, of one very important fact that you seem to be overlooking. The language of utopia, sir, is French. I want to remind you of that. I want to recall it to your mind. I will lay no stress here on the sacrifices and martyrdoms that France has endured in the cause of civilization." The voice of Mr. Burleigh interrupted. "A very natural misconception, but if you will pardon the correction, the language of utopia is not French." Of course Mr. Barnstaple reflected. Monsieur Dupont had not heard the explanation of the language difficulty. "Permit me, sir, to believe the evidence of my own ears," the Frenchman replied with dignified politeness. "These utopians, I can assure you, speak French, and nothing but French, and very excellent French it is." "They speak no language at all," said Mr. Burleigh. "Not even English?" sneered Monsieur Dupont. "Not even English." "Not League of Nations, perhaps? But, bah, why do I argue? They speak French. Not even a Boche would deny it. It needs an Englishman." A beautiful wrangle, thought Mr. Barnstaple. There was no utopian present to undeceive Monsieur Dupont, and he stuck to his belief magnificently. With a mixture of pity and derision and anger, Mr. Barnstaple listened to this little band of lost human beings in the twilight of a vast, strange, possibly inimical world, growing more and more fierce and keen in a dispute over the claims of their three nations to dominate Utopia, claims based entirely upon greeds and misconceptions. Their voices rose to shouts and sank to passionate intensity as their lifelong habits of national egotism reasserted themselves. Mr. Hunker would hear nothing of an empire. Monsieur Dupont would hear of nothing but the supreme claim of France. Mr. Catskill twisted and turned. To Mr. Barnstaple this conflict of patriotic prepossession seemed like a dogfight on a sinking ship. But at last Mr. Catskill, persistent and ingenious, made headway against his two antagonists. He stood at the end of the table explaining that he had used the word empire loosely, apologizing for using it, explaining that when he said empire he had all Western civilization in mind. "When I said it," he said, turning to Mr. Hunker, "I meant a common brotherhood of understanding." He faced toward Monsieur Dupont. "I meant our tried and imperishable entente." "There are at least no Russians here," said Monsieur Dupont, "and no Germans." "True," said Lord Baralonga. "We start ahead of the Hun here, and we can keep ahead." "And I take it," said Mr. Hunker, "that Japanese are barred." "No reason why we shouldn't start clean with a complete color bar," reflected Lord Baralonga. "This seems to me a white man's world." "At the same time," said Monsieur Dupont, coldly and insistently, "you will forgive me if I ask you for some clearer definition of our present relationship, and for some guarantee, some effective guarantee, that the immense sacrifices France has made and still makes in the cause of civilized life will receive their proper recognition and their due reward in this adventure." "I only ask for justice," said Monsieur Dupont. Section 5. Indignation made Mr. Barnstaple bold. He got down from his perch upon the wall and came up to the table. "Are you mad," he said, "or am I? This squabble over flags and countries and fanciful rites and deserts, it is hopeless folly. Do you not realize even now the position we are in?" His breath failed him for a moment. Then he resumed. "Are you incapable of thinking of human affairs except in terms of flags and fighting and conquest and robbery? Can you not realize the proportion of things and the quality of this world into which we have fallen? As I have said already, we are like some band of savages in a show at Earl's Court, plotting the subjugation of London. We are like suppressed cannibals in the hearts of a great city, dreaming of a revival of our ancient and forgotten filthiness. What are our chances in this fantastic struggle?" Mr. Ridley spoke reprovingly. "You are forgetting everything you've just been told. Everything. Arf, their population is laid out with flu and measles, and there's no such thing as a healthy fighting will left in all Utopia." "Precisely," said Mr. Catskill. "Well, suppose you have chances. That makes your scheme the more hopeful. It also makes it the more horrible. Here we are lifted up out of the troubles of our time to a vision, to a reality of civilization such as our own world could only hope to climb to in scores of centuries. Here is a world at peace, splendid, happy, full of wisdom and hope. If our puny strength and base cunning can contrive it, we are to shatter it all. We are proposing to wreck a world. I tell you it is not an adventure. It is a crime. It is an abomination. I will have no part in it. I am against you in this attempt." Father Amerton would have spoken, but Mr. Burleigh arrested him by a gesture. "What would you have us do?" asked Mr. Burleigh. "Submit to their science. Learn what we can from them. In a little while we may be cured of our inherent poisons, and we may be permitted to return from this outlying desert of mines and turbines and rock to those gardens of habitation we have as yet scarcely seen. There we too may learn something of civilization. In the end we may even go back to our own disordered world, with knowledge, with hope and help, missionaries of a new order." "But why—" began Father Amerton. Again Mr. Burleigh took the word. "Everything, you say," he remarked, "rests on unproven assumptions. You choose to see this utopia through rose-tinted glasses. We others, for it is," he counted, 11-1 against you, "see things without such favourable preconceptions." "And I may ask, sir," said Father Amerton, springing to his feet, and hitting the table a blow that set all the glasses talking, "may I ask who you are to set yourself up as a judge and censor of the common opinion of mankind? For I tell you, sir, that here in this lonely and wicked and strange world, we 12, do represent mankind. We are the advance guard, the pioneers in the new world that God has given us, even as he gave Canaan to Israel, his chosen, 3,000 years ago. Who are you?" "Exactly," said Pank. "Who are you?" And Mr. Ridley reinforced him with a shout, "Who the hell are you?" Mr. Barnstaple had no platform skill to meet so direct an attack. He stood helpless. Astonishingly, Lady Stella came to his rescue. "That isn't fair, Father Amerton," she said. "Mr. Barnstaple, whoever he is, has a perfect right to express his own opinion." "And having expressed it," said Mr. Catskill, who had been walking up and down on the other side of the table to that on which Mr. Barnstaple stood, "having expressed it, to allow us to proceed with the business in hand. I suppose it was inevitable that we should find the conscientious objector in our midst, even in Utopia. The rest of us, I take it, are very much of one mind about our situation." "We are," said Mr. Mush, regarding Mr. Barnstaple with a malevolent expression. "Very well. Then I suppose we must follow the precedents established for such cases. We will not ask Mr. Barnstaple to share the dangers and the honours of a combatant. We'll ask him merely to do civilian work of a helpful nature." Mr. Barnstaple held up his hand. "No," he said, "I am not disposed to be helpful. I do not recognize the analogy of the situation to the needs of the Great War, and anyhow I am entirely opposed to this project, this brigandage of a civilization. You cannot call me a conscientious objector to fighting, because I do not object to fighting in a just cause. But this adventure of yours is not a just cause. I implore you, Mr. Burleigh, you who are not merely a politician, but a man of culture and a philosopher, to reconsider what it is we are being urged towards acts of violence and mischief from which there will be no drawing back." "Mr. Barnstaple," said Mr. Burleigh, with grave dignity and something like a note of reproach in his voice, "I have considered, but I think I may venture to say that I am a man of some experience, some traditional experience in human affairs. I may not altogether agree with my friend, Mr. Catskill. Nay, I will go further and say that in many respects I do not agree with him. If I were the autocrat here, I would say that we have to offer these utopians resistance for our self-respect, but not to offer them the violent and aggressive resistance that he contemplates. I think we could be far more subtle, far more elaborate, and far more successful than Mr. Catskill is likely to be. But that is my own opinion. Neither Mr. Hunker, nor Lord Baralonga, nor Mr. Mush, nor Monsieur Dupont shares it. Nor do our friends the technical engineers here share it. And what I do perceive to be imperative upon our little band of earthlings lost here in a strange universe is unity of action. Whatever else betide, dissension must not betray us. We must hold together and act together as one body. Discuss it, if you will, when there is any time for discussion, but in the end decide, and having decided, abide loyally by the decision. Upon the need of securing a hostage or two, I have no manner of doubt whatever. Mr. Catskill is right. Mr. Barnstaple was a bad debater, but these utopians are as human as we are, he said. All that is most sane and civilized in ourselves is with them. Mr. Ridley interrupted in a voice designedly rough. "Oh, Lord," he said, "we can't go on jawing here forever. It's sunset, and this gentleman 'as 'ad his say, and more than his say. We ought to have our places, and know what is expected of us, before night. May I propose that we elect Mr. Catskill our captain, with full military powers?" "I second that," said Mr. Burleigh, with grave humility. "Perhaps Monsieur Dupont," said Mr. Catskill, "will act with me as associated captain, representing our glorious ally, his own great country." "In the absence of a more worthy representative," acquiesced Monsieur Dupont, "and to see that French interests are duly respected." "And if Mr. Hunker would act as my lieutenant, Lord Barralonga will be our quartermaster, and Father Amerton our chaplain and censor. Mr. Burleigh, it goes without saying, will be our civil head." Mr. Hunker coughed. He frowned with the expression of one who makes a difficult explanation. "I won't be exactly lieutenant," he said. "I'll take no official position. I've a sort of distaste for foreign entanglements. I'll be a looker-on who helps. But I think you will find that you can count on me, gentlemen, when help is needed." Mr. Catskill seated himself at the head of the table, and indicated the chair next to his for Monsieur Dupont. Miss Greta Gray seated herself on his other hand between him and Mr. Hunker. Mr. Burleigh remained in his place, a chair or so from Mr. Hunker. The rest came and stood round the captain, except Lady Stella and Mr. Barnstaple. Almost ostentatiously Mr. Barnstaple turned his back on the new command. Lady Stella, he saw, remained seated far down the table, looking dubiously at the little crowd of people at the end. Then her eyes went to the desolate mountain crest beyond. She shivered violently and stood up. "It's going to be very cold here after sunset," she said, with nobody heeding her. "I shall go and unpack a wrap." She walked slowly to her quarters and did not reappear. Section 6. Mr. Barnstaple did not want to seem to listen to this council of war. He walked to the wall of the old castle and up a flight of stone steps, and along the rampart to the peak of the headland. Here the shattering and beating sound of the waters in the two convergent canyons was very loud. There was still a bright upper rim of sunlit rock on the mountain face behind, but all the rest of the world was now in a deepening blue shadow, and a fleecy white mist was gathering in the canyons below and hiding the noisy torrents. It drifted up almost to the level of the little bridge that spanned the narrower canyon to a railed stepway from the crest of the further side. For the first time since he had arrived in Utopia, Mr. Barnstaple felt a chill in the air, and loneliness like a pain. Upon the broader of the two meeting canyons some kind of engineering work was going on, and periodic flashes lit the drifting mist. Far away over the mountains a solitary aeroplane, very high, caught the sun's rays ever and again, and sent down quivering flashes of dazzling gold light, and then, as it wheeled about, vanished again in the deepening blue. He looked down into the great courtyard of the ancient castle below him. The modern buildings in the twilight looked like phantom pavilions amidst the archaic masonry. Someone had brought a light, and Captain Rupert Catskill, the new Cortez, was writing orders while his commandos stood about him. The light shone on the face and shoulders and arms of Miss Greta Gray. She was peering over the captain's arm to see what he was writing, and as Mr. Barnstaple looked, he saw her raise her hand suddenly to conceal an involuntary yawn. Book 2, Chapter 3. Mr. Barnstaple as a Traitor to Mankind. 1. Mr. Barnstaple spent a large part of the night sitting upon his bed and brooding over the incalculable elements of the situation in which he found himself. What could he do? What ought he to do? Where did his loyalty lie? The dark traditions and infections of the earth had turned this wonderful encounter into an ugly and dangerous antagonism far too swiftly for him to adjust his mind to the new situation. Before him now only two possibilities seemed open. Either the utopians would prove themselves altogether the stronger and the wiser, and he and all his fellow pirates would be crushed and killed like vermin, or the desperate ambitions of Mr. Catskill would be realized, and they would become a spreading sore in the fair body of this noble civilization, a band of robbers and destroyers, dragging Utopia year by year and age by age back to terrestrial conditions. There seemed only one escape from the dilemma: to get away from this fastness to the utopians, to reveal the whole scheme of the earthlings to them, and to throw himself and his associates upon their mercy. But this must be done soon, before the hostages were seized and bloodshed began. But in the first place it might be very difficult now to get away from the earthling band. Mr. Catskill would already have organized watchers and sentinels, and the peculiar position of the crag exposed every avenue of escape. And in the next place, Mr. Barnstaple had a lifelong habit of mind which predisposed him against tale-bearing and dissentient action. His school training had molded him into subservience to any group or gang in which he found himself. His form, his side, his house, his school, his club, his party, and so forth. Yet his intelligence and his limitless curiosities had always been opposed to these narrow conspiracies against the world at large. His spirit had made him an uncomfortable rebel throughout his whole earthly existence. He loathed political parties and political leaders. He despised and rejected nationalism and imperialism and all the tawdry loyalties associated with them. The aggressive conqueror, the grabbing financier, the shoving businessman, he hated as he hated wasps, rats, hyenas, sharks, fleas, nettles, and the like. All his life he had been a citizen of Utopia, exiled from earth. After his fashion he has sought to serve Utopia. But why should he not serve Utopia now? Because his band was a little and desperate band? That was no reason why he should serve the things he hated. If they were a desperate crew, the fact remained that they were also, as a whole, an evil crew. There is no reason why liberalism should degenerate into a morbid passion for minorities. Only two persons among the earthlings, Lady Stella and Mr. Burleigh, held any of his sympathy, and he had his doubts about Mr. Burleigh. Mr. Burleigh was one of those strange people who seem to understand everything and feel nothing. He impressed Mr. Barnstaple as being intelligently irresponsible. Wasn't that really more evil than being unintelligently adventurous like Hunker or Baralonga? Mr. Barnstaple's mind returned from a long excursion into ethics to the realities about him. Tomorrow he would survey the position and make his plans, and perhaps in the twilight he would slip away. It was entirely in his character to defer action in this way for the better part of the day. His life had been one of deferred action almost from the beginning. Part 2. But events could not wait for Mr. Barnstaple. He was called at dawn by Penck, who told him that henceforth the garrison would be aroused every morning by an electric hooter he and Ridley had contrived. As Penck spoke, a devastating howl from this contrivance inaugurated the new era. He handed Mr. Barnstaple a slip of paper torn from a notebook on which Mr. Catskill had written: "Non-com. Barnaby. To assist Ridley prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Times and menu on messroom wall. Clear away and wash up smartly, and at other times be at disposal of Lieutenant Hunker in chemical laboratory for experimenting and bomb making. Keep laboratory clean." "That's your job," said Penck. "Ridley's waiting for you." "Well," said Mr. Barnstaple, and got up. It was no use precipitating a quarrel if he was going to escape. So he went to the scarred and bandaged Ridley, and they produced a very good imitation of a British military kitchen in that great raw year 1914. Everyone was turned out to breakfast at 6:30 by a second solo on the hooter. The men were paraded and inspected by Mr. Catskill, with M. Dupont standing beside him. Mr. Hunker stood parallel with these two and a few yards away. All the other men fell in except Mr. Burleigh, who was to be civil commander in Utopia, and was in that capacity in bed, and Mr. Barnstaple, the non-combatant. Miss Greta Gray and Lady Stella sat in a sunny corner of the courtyard sewing at a flag. It was to be a blue flag with a white star, a design sufficiently unlike any existing national flag to avoid wounding the patriotic susceptibilities of any of the party. It was to represent the Earthling League of Nations. After the parade, the little garrison dispersed to its various posts and duties. M. Dupont assumed the chief command, and Mr. Catskill, who had watched all night, went to lie down. He had the Napoleonic quality of going off to sleep for an hour or so at any time in the day. Mr. Penck went up to the top of the castle where the hooter was installed, to keep a lookout. There were some moments to be snatched between the time when Mr. Barnstaple had finished with Ridley and the time when Hunker would discover his help was available, and this time he devoted to an inspection of the castle wall on the side of the slopes. While he was standing on the old rampart, weighing his chances of slipping away that evening in the twilight, an aeroplane appeared above the crag and came down upon the nearer slope. 2 utopians descended, talked with their aviator for a time, and then turned their faces toward the fastness of the earthlings. A single note of the hooter brought out Mr. Catskill upon the rampart beside Mr. Barnstaple. He produced a field-glass and surveyed the approaching figures. "Serpentine and cedar," he said, lowering his field-glass. "And they come alone. Good." He turned round and signalled with his hand to Penck, who responded with 2 short whoops of his instrument. This was the signal for a general assembly. Down below the courtyard appeared the rest of the Allied force and Mr. Hunker, and fell in with a reasonable imitation of discipline. Mr. Catskill passed Mr. Barnstaple without taking any notice of him, joined M. Dupont, Mr. Hunker, and their subordinates below, and proceeded to instruct them in his plans for the forthcoming crisis. Mr. Barnstaple could not hear what was said. He noted with sardonic disapproval that each man, as Mr. Catskill finished with him, clicked his heels together and saluted. Then, at a word of command, they dispersed to their posts. There was a partly ruined flight of steps leading down from the general level of the courtyard through this great archway in the wall that gave access to and from the slopes below. Ridley and Mush went down to the right of these steps and placed themselves below a projecting mass of masonry, so as to be hidden from anyone approaching from below. Father Amerton and Mr. Hunker concealed themselves similarly to the left. Father Amerton, Mr. Barnstaple noted, had been given a coil of rope, and then his roving eye discovered Mr. Mush glancing at a pistol in his hand, and then replacing it in his pocket. Lord Barralonga took up a position for himself some steps above Mr. Mush, and produced a revolver which he held in his one efficient hand. Mr. Catskill remained at the head of the stairs. He also was holding a revolver. He turned to the citadel, considered the case of Penck for a moment, and then motioned him down to join the others. M. Dupont, armed with a stout table leg, placed himself at Mr. Catskill's right hand. For a time Mr. Barnstaple watched these dispositions without any realization of their significance. Then his eyes went from the crouching figures within the castle to the 2 unsuspecting utopians who were coming up towards them, and he realized that in a couple of minutes Serpentine and Cedar would be struggling in the grip of their captors. He perceived he had to act, and his had been a contemplative, critical life with no habit of decision. He found himself trembling violently. Part 3. He still desired some mediatory intervention, even in these fatal last moments. He raised an arm and cried "Hi!" as much to the earthlings below as to the utopians without. No one noticed either his gesture or his feeble cry. Then his will seemed to break through a tangle of obstacles to one simple idea. Serpentine and Cedar must not be seized. He was amazed and indignant at his own vacillation. Of course they must not be seized. This foolery must be thwarted forthwith. In 4 strides he was on the wall above the archway, and now he was shouting loud and clear. "Danger!" he shouted. "Danger!" and again "Danger!" He heard Catskill's cry of astonishment, and then a pistol bullet whipped through the air close to him. Serpentine stopped short and looked up, touched Cedar's arm, and pointed. "These earthlings want to imprison you. Don't come here. Danger!" yelled Mr. Barnstaple, waving his arms, and pat, 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 Mr. Catskill experienced the disappointments of revolver shooting. Serpentine and Cedar were turning back, but slowly and hesitatingly. For a moment Mr. Catskill knew not what to do. Then he flung himself down the steps, crying, "After them! Stop them! Come on!" "Go back!" cried Mr. Barnstaple to the Utopians. "Go back! Quickly! Quickly!" Came a clatter of feet from below, and then the 8 men who constituted the combat strength of the earthling forces in Utopia emerged from under the archway, running towards the 2 astonished Utopians. Mr. Mush fled, with Ridley at his heels. He was pointing his revolver and shouting. Next came M. Dupont, zealous and active. Father Amberton took up the rear with the rope. "Go back!" screamed Mr. Barnstaple, with his voice breaking. Then he stopped shouting and watched, with his hands clenched. The aviator was running down the slope from his machine to the assistance of Serpentine and Cedar, and above, out of the blue, 2 other aeroplanes had appeared. The 2 Utopians disdained to hurry, and in a few seconds their pursuers had come back up with them. Hunker, Ridley, and Mush led the attack. M. Dupont, flourishing his stick, was abreast with them, but running out to the right as though he intended to get between them and the aviator. Mr. Catskill and Penck were a little behind the leading 3. The one-armed Baralonga was perhaps 10 yards behind, and Father Amberton had halted to recoil his rope more conveniently. There seemed to be a moment's parley, and then Serpentine had moved quickly as if to seize Hunker. A pistol cracked, and then another went off rapidly, 3 times. "Oh, God!" cried Mr. Barnstaple. "Oh, God!" as he saw Serpentine throw up his arms and fall backward. And then Cedar had grasped and lifted up Mush and hurled him at Mr. Catskill and Penck, bowling both of them over into one indistinguishable heap. With a wild cry, M. Dupont closed in on Cedar, but not quickly enough. His club shot into the air as Cedar parried his blow, and then the Utopian stooped, caught him by a leg, overthrew him, lifted him, and whirled him round as one might whirl a rabbit, to inflict a stunning blow on Mr. Hunker. Lord Baralonga ran back some paces and began shooting at the approaching aviator. The confusion of legs and arms on the ground became 3 separate people again. Mr. Catskill, shouting directions, made for Cedar, followed by Penck and Mush, and a moment after by Hunker and Dupont. They clung to Cedar as hounds will cling to a boar. Time after time he flung them off. Father Amberton hovered unhelpfully with his rope. For some moments Mr. Barnstaple's attention was concentrated upon this swaying and staggering attempt to overpower Cedar, and then he became aware of other Utopians running down the slope to join the fray. The other 2 aeroplanes had landed. Mr. Catskill realized the coming of these reinforcements almost as soon as Mr. Barnstaple. His shouts of "Back! Back to the castle!" reached Mr. Barnstaple's ears. The earthling scattered away from the tall, dishevelled figure, hesitated, and began to walk, and then run back towards the castle. And then Ridley turned and very deliberately shot Cedar, who clutched at his breast and fell into a sitting position. The earthlings retreated to the foot of the steps that led up through the archway into the castle, and stood there in a panting, bruised, and ruffled group. 50 yards away, Serpentine lay still. The aviator whom Baralonga had shot writhed and moaned, and Cedar sat up with blood upon his chest, trying to feel his back. 5 other Utopians came hurrying to their assistance. "What is all this firing?" said Lady Stella, suddenly at Mr. Barnstaple's elbow. "Have they caught their hostages?" asked Miss Greta Gray. "For the life of me," said Mr. Burleigh, who had come out upon the wall a yard or so away, "this ought never to have happened. How did this get muffed, Lady Stella?" "I called out to them," said Mr. Barnstaple. "You called out to them?" said Mr. Burleigh, incredulous. "Treason I did not calculate upon," came the wrathful voice of Mr. Catskill, ascending out of the archway. Part 4. For some moments Mr. Barnstaple made no attempt to escape the danger that closed in upon him. He had always lived a life of very great security, and with him, as with so many highly civilized types, the power of apprehending personal danger was very largely atrophied. He was a spectator by temperament and training alike. He stood now as if he looked at himself, the central figure of a great and hopeless tragedy. The idea of flight came belatedly, in a reluctant and apologetic manner, into his mind. "Shot as a traitor," he said aloud. "Shot as a traitor." There was that bridge over the narrow gorge. He might still get over that if he went for it at once, if he was quicker than they were. He was too intelligent to dash off for it. That would certainly have set the others running. He walked along the wall in a leisurely fashion past Mr. Burleigh, himself too civilized to intervene. In a quickening stroll he gained the steps that led to the citadel. Then he stood still for a moment to survey the situation. Catskill was busy setting sentinels at the gate. Perhaps he had not thought yet of the little bridge, and imagined that Mr. Barnstaple was at his disposal at any time that suited him. Up the slope the utopians were carrying off the dead or wounded men. Mr. Barnstaple ascended the steps as if buried in thought, and stood on the citadel for some seconds, his hands in his trouser pockets, as if he surveyed the view. Then he turned to the winding staircase that went down to a sort of guard-room below. As soon as he was surely out of sight, he began to think and move very quickly. The guard-room was perplexing. It had 5 doors, any one of which, except the one by which he had just entered the room, might lead down to the staircase. Against one, however, stood a pile of neat packing-cases. That left 3 to choose from. He ran from one to the other, leaving each door open. In each case stone steps ran down to a landing and a turning place. He stood hesitating at the third, and noted that a cold draught came blowing up it. Surely that meant that this went down to the cliff face. Or whence came the air? Surely this was it. Should he shut the doors he had open? No, leave them all open. He heard a clatter coming down the staircase from the citadel. Softly and swiftly he ran down the steps, and halted for a second at the corner landing. He was compelled to stop and listen to the movements of his pursuers. "This is the door to the bridge, sir," he heard Ridley cry, and then he heard Catskill say, "The Tarpeian Rock and Barralonga, exactly. Why should we waste a cartridge? Are you sure this goes to the bridge, Ridley?" The footsteps pattered across the guard-room and passed, down one of the other staircases. "A reprieve," whispered Barnstaple, and then stopped aghast. He was trapped. The staircase they were on was the staircase to the bridge. They would go down as far as the bridge, and as soon as they got to it, they would see that he was neither on it nor on the steps on the opposite side of the gorge, and that therefore he could not possibly have escaped. They would certainly bar that way, either by closing and fastening any door there might be, or, failing such a barrier, by setting a sentinel, and then they would come back and hunt for him at their leisure. What was it Catskill had been saying? The Tarpeian Rock? Horrible! They mustn't take him alive. He must fight like a rat in a corner and oblige them to shoot him. He went on down the staircase. It became very dark and then grew light again. It ended in an ordinary big cellar, which may once have been a gun-pit or magazine. It was fairly well lit by 2 unglazed windows cut in the rock. It now contained a store of provisions. Along one side stood an array of the flask-like bottles that were used for wine in Utopia. Along the other was a miscellany of packing-cases and cubes wrapped in gold leaf. He lifted one of the glass flasks by its neck. It would make an effective club. Suppose he made a sort of barrier of the packing-cases across the entrance, and stood beside it and clubbed the pursuers as they came in. Glass and wine would smash over their skulls. It would take time to make the barrier. He chose and carried 3 of the larger flasks to the doorway, where they would be handy for him. Then he had an inspiration, and looked at the window. He listened at the door of the staircase for a time. Not a sound came from above. He went to the window and lay down in the deep embrasure, and wiggled forward until he could see out and up and down. The cliff below fell sheer. he could have spat on to the brawling torrent 15 feet perhaps below. The crag here was made up of almost vertical strata which projected and receded. A big buttress hid almost all of the bridge except the far end, which seemed to be about 20 or 30 yards lower than the opening from which Mr. Barnstaple was looking. Mr. Catskill appeared upon this bridge, very small and distant, scrutinizing the rocky stairway beyond the bridge. Mr. Barnstaple withdrew his head hastily. Then very discreetly he peeped again. Mr. Catskill was no longer to be seen. He was coming back. To business. There was not much time. In his earlier days, before the Great War had made travel dear and uncomfortable, Mr. Barnstaple had done some rock climbing in Switzerland, and he had also some experience in Cumberland and Wales. He surveyed now the rocks close at hand with an intelligent expertness. They were cut by almost horizontal joint planes into which there had been a considerable infiltration, chiefly of white crystalline material. This stuff, which he guessed was calcite, had weathered more rapidly than the general material of the rock, leaving a series of irregular horizontal grooves. With luck it might be possible to work along the cliff face, turn the buttress, and scramble to the bridge. And then came an even more hopeful idea. He could easily get along the cliff face to the first recess, flatten himself there, and remain until the earthlings had searched his cellar. After they had searched, he might creep back into the cellar. Even if they looked out of the window, they would not see him, and even if he left finger marks and so forth in the embrasure, they would likely to conclude that he had either jumped or fallen down the crag into the gorge below. But at first it might be slow work negotiating the cliff face, and this would cut him off from his weapons, the flasks. But the idea of hiding in the recess had taken a strong hold upon his imagination. Very cautiously he got out of the window, found a handhold, got his feet onto his ledge, and began to work his way along toward his niche. But there were unexpected difficulties. A gap of nearly 5 yards in the handhold. Nothing. He had to flatten himself and trust to his feet, and for a time he remained quite still in that position. Further on was a rotten lump of the vein mineral, and it broke away under him very disconcertingly. But happily his fingers had a grip, and the other foot was firm. The detached crystals slithered down the rock face for a moment, and then made no further sound. They had dropped into the void. For a time he was paralyzed. "In good form," whispered Barnstaple. "I'm not in good form." He clung motionless and prayed. With an effort he resumed his traverse. He was at the very corner of the recess when some faint noise drew his eyes to the window from which he had emerged. Ridley's face was poked out slowly and cautiously, his eye red and fierce among his white bandages. 5. He did not at first see Mr. Barnstaple. "God!" he said when he did so, and withdrew his head hastily. Came a sound of voices saying indistinguishable things. Some inappropriate instinct kept Barnstaple quite still, though he could have gotten into cover in the recess quite easily before Mr. Catskill looked out, revolver in hands. For some moments they stared at each other in silence. "Come back, or I shoot," said Mr. Catskill, unconvincingly. "Shoot," said Mr. Barnstaple, after a moment's reflection. Mr. Catskill craned his head out and stared down into the shadowy blue depths of the canyon. "It isn't necessary," he answered. "We have to save cartridges." "You haven't the guts," said Mr. Barnstaple. "It's not quite that," said Mr. Catskill. "No," said Mr. Barnstaple, "it isn't. You are fundamentally a civilized man." Mr. Catskill scowled at him without hostility. "You have a very good imagination," Mr. Barnstaple reflected. "The trouble is that you have been so damnably educated. What is the trouble with you? You are be-Kiplinged. Empire and Anglo-Saxon and Boy Scout and sleuth are the stuff in your mind. If I had gone to Eton I might have been the same as you are, I suppose." "Harrow," corrected Mr. Catskill. "A perfectly beastly public school. Suburban place where the boys wear chignons and straw halos. I might have guessed Harrow. But it's queer I bear you no malice. Given decent ideas you might have been very different from what you are. If I had been your schoolmaster... But it's too late now. "It is," said Mr. Rupert Catskill, smiling genially, and cocked his eye down into the canyon. Mr. Barnstaple began to feel for his ledge round the corner with a foot. "Don't go for a minute," said Mr. Catskill. "I'm not going to shoot." A voice from within, probably Lord Barralonga, said something about heaving a rock at Mr. Barnstaple. Someone else, probably Ridley, approved ferociously. "Not without due form of trial," said Mr. Catskill over his shoulder. His face was inscrutable, but a fantastic idea began to run about in Mr. Barnstaple's mind that Mr. Catskill did not want to have him killed. He had thought about things, and he wanted him now to escape to the utopians and perhaps rig up some sort of settlement with them. "We intend to try you, sir," said Mr. Catskill. "We intend to try you. We cite you to appear." Mr. Catskill moistened his lips and considered. "The court will sit almost at once." His little bright brown eyes estimated the chances of Mr. Barnstaple's position very rapidly. He craned towards the bridge. "We shall not waste time over our procedure," he said, "and I have little doubt of our verdict. We shall condemn you to death. So there you are, sir. I doubt if we shall be more than a quarter of an hour before your fate is legally settled." He glanced up, trying to see the crest of the crag. "We shall probably throw rocks," he said. "Moriturus te saluo," said Mr. Barnstaple, with an air of making a witty remark. "If you will forgive me, I will go on now to make a more comfortable position." Mr. Catskill remained looking hard at him. "I've never borne you any ill will," said Mr. Barnstaple. "Had I been your schoolmaster, everything might have been different. Thanks for the quarter of an hour more you give me. And if by any chance—" "Exactly," said Mr. Catskill. They understood one another. When Mr. Barnstaple stepped round the bend into the recess, Mr. Catskill was still looking out, and Lord Barralonga was faintly audible, advocating the immediate heaving of rocks. Part 6. The ways of the human mind are past finding out. From desperation, Mr. Barnstaple's mood had passed to exhilaration. His first sick horror of climbing above this immense height had given him place now to an almost boyish assurance. His sense of immediate death had gone. He was appreciating this adventure. Indeed, he was enjoying it, with an entire disregard now of how it was to end. He made fairly good time until he got to the angle of the buttress, though his arms began to ache rather badly, and then he had a shock. He now had a full view of the bridge and up the narrow gorge. The ledge he was working along did not run to the bridge at all. He ran a good 30 feet below it, and what was worse, between himself and the bridge were 2 gullies and chimneys of uncertain depth. At this discovery he regretted for the first time that he had not stayed in the cellar and made a fight for it there. He had some minutes of indecision, with the ache in his arms increasing. He was roused from his inaction by what he thought at first was the shadow of a swift-flying bird on the rock. Presently it returned. He hoped he would not be assailed by birds. He had read a story, but never mind that now. Then came a loud crack overhead, and he glanced up to see a lump of rock which had just struck a little bulge above him fly to fragments. From which incident he gathered firstly that the court had delivered an adverse verdict rather in advance of Mr. Catskill's time, and secondly that he was visible from above. He resumed his traverse toward the shelter of the gully with feverish energy. The gully was better than he expected. A chimney, difficult he thought to ascend, but quite practicable downward. It was completely overhung, and perhaps 100 feet below there was a sort of step in it that gave a quite broad recess, sheltered from above, and with room enough for a man to sprawl on it if he wanted to do so. There would be rest for Mr. Barnstaple's arms, and without any needless delay he clambered down to it and abandoned himself to the delightful sensation of not holding on to anything. He was out of sight and out of reach of his earthling pursuers. In the back of the recess was a trickle of water. He drank and began to think of food and to regret that he had not brought some provision for him from the store in the cellar. He might have opened one of those gold leaf covered cubes or pocketed a small flask of wine. Wine would be very heartening just now. But it did not do to think of that. He stayed for a long time, as it seemed to him, on this precious shelf, scrutinizing the chimney below very carefully. It seemed quite practicable for a long way down. The sides became very smooth, but they seemed close enough together to get down with his back against one side and his feet against the other. He looked at his wrist watch. It was still not 9 o'clock in the morning. It was about 10 minutes to 9. He had been called by Ridley before 5:30. At 6:30 he had been handing out breakfast in the courtyard. Serpentine and Cedar must have appeared about 8 o'clock. In about 10 minutes Serpentine had been murdered. Then the flight and the pursuit. How quickly things happen! He had all day before him. He would resume his descent at 9:30. Until then he would rest. It was absurd to feel hungry yet. He was climbing again before 9:30. For perhaps 100 feet it was easy. Then by imperceptible degrees the gully broadened. He only realized it when he found himself slipping. He slipped, struggling furiously, for perhaps 20 feet, and then fell outright another 10, and struck a rock, and was held by a second shelf much broader than the one above. He came down on it with a jarring concussion, and happily he rolled inward. He was bruised, but not seriously hurt. "My luck," he said, "my luck holds good." He rested for a time, and then, confident that things would be all right, set himself to inspect the next stage of his descent. It was with a sort of incredulity that he discovered the chimney below his shelf was absolutely unclimbable. It was just a straight, smooth rock on either side for 20 yards at least, and 6 feet wide. He might as well fling himself over at once as try to get down that. Then he saw that it was equally impossible to retrace his steps. He could not believe it. It seemed too silly. He laughed as one might laugh if one found one's own mother refusing to recognize one after a day's absence. Then abruptly he stopped laughing. He repeated every point in his examination. He fingered the smooth rocks about him. "But this is absurd," he said, breaking out into a cold perspiration. There was no way out of this corner into which he had so painfully and laboriously got himself. He could neither go on nor go back. He was caught. His luck had given out. Part 7. At midday, by his wrist-watch, Mr. Barnstaple was sitting in his recess as a weary invalid suffering from some incurable disease might sit up in an armchair during a temporary respite from pain, with nothing to do and no hope before him. There was not one chance in 10,000 that anything could happen to release him from this trap into which he had clambered. There was a trickle of water at the back, but no food, not even a grass blade to nibble. Unless he saw fit to pitch himself over into the gorge, he must starve to death. It would perhaps be cold at nights, but not cold enough to kill him. To this end he had come then out of the worried journalism of London and the domesticities of Sydenham. Queer journey it was that he and the Yellow Peril had made. Camberwell, Victoria, Hounslow, Slough, Utopia, the mountain paradise, 100 fascinating and tantalizing glimpses of a world of real happiness and order, that long aeroplane flight half round a world, and now death. The idea of abbreviating his sufferings by jumping over had no appeal for him. He would stay here and suffer such suffering as there might be before the end. And 300 yards away or so were his fellow earthlings, also awaiting their fate. It was amazing. It was prosaic. After all, to this, or something like this, humanity had come. Sooner or later, people had to lie and suffer. They had to think, and then think feverishly, and then weakly, and so fade to a final cessation of thought. On the whole, he thought it was preferable to die in this fashion, preferable to a sudden death. It was worth while to look death in the face for a time, to have leisure to write Finney in one's mind, to think over life and such living as one had done, and to think it over with a detachment and independence that only an entire inability to alter one jot of it now could give. At present his mind was clear and calm. A bleak serenity, like a clear winter sky, possessed him. There was suffering ahead, he knew, but he did not believe it would be intolerable suffering. If it proved intolerable, the canyon yawned below. In that respect, the shelf or rock was a better death-bed than most, a more convenient death-bed. Your sick-bed presented pain with a wide margin, set it up for your too complete examination. But to starve was not so very dreadful, he had read. Hunger and pain there would be, most distressful about the third day, and after that one became feeble and did not feel so much. It would not be like the torture of many cancer cases, or the agony of brain fever. It would not be one tithe as bad as that. Lonely it would be, but is one much less lonely on a deathbed at home? They come and say there, and do little serviceable things, but are there any other interchanges? You go your solitary way, speech and movement and the desire to speak or move passing from you, and their voices fade. Everywhere death is a very solitary act, a going apart. A younger man would probably have found this loneliness in the gorge very terrible, but Mr. Barnstaple had outlived the intenser delusions of companionship. He would have liked a last talk with his boys and to have put his wife into a good frame of mind, but even these desires were perhaps more sentimental than real. When it came to talks with his boys, he was apt to feel shy, as they had come to have personalities of their own, and to grow through adolescence. He had felt more and more that talking intimately to them was an invasion of their right to grow up along their own lines. And they, too, he felt, were shy with him, defensively shy. Perhaps later on sons come back to a man. That was a later on that he would never know now. But he wished he could have let them know what had happened to him. That troubled him. It would set him right in their eyes. It would perhaps be better for their characters if they did not think, as they were almost bound to think, that he had run away from them, or lapsed mentally, or even fallen into bad company and been made away with. As it was, they might be worried and ashamed needlessly, or put to expense to find out where he was, and that would be a pity. One had to die. Many men had died as he was going to die, fallen into strange places, lost in dark caverns, marooned on desert islands, astray in the Australian bush, imprisoned and left to perish. It was good to die without great anguish or insult. He thought of the myriads of men who had been crucified by the Romans. Was it 8,000 or was it 10,000 of the army of Spartacus that they killed in that fashion along the Appian Way? Of negroes hung in chains to starve, and of endless variety of such deaths. Shocking to young imaginations, such things were more and more fearful in thought than in reality. It is all a matter of a little more pain or a little less pain. But God will not have any great waste of pain. Cross, wheel, electric chair, or bed of suffering, the thing is you die and have done. It's pleasant to find that one could think stoutly of these things. It was good to be caught and to find that one was not frantic. And Mr. Barnstaple was surprised to find how little he cared now that he faced the issue closely, whether he was immortal or he was not. He was quite prepared to find himself immortal, or at least not ending with death in whole or in part. It was ridiculous to be dogmatic and say that a part, an impression of his conscience and even of his willing life might not go on in some fashion. But he found it impossible to imagine how that could be. It was unimaginable. It was not to be anticipated. He had no fear of that continuation. He had no thought nor fear of the possibility of punishment or cruelty. The universe had at times seemed to him to be very carelessly put together, but he had never believed that it was the work of a malignant imbecile. It impressed him as immensely careless, but not as dominatingly cruel. He had been what he had been, weak and limited and sometimes silly, but the punishment of these defects lay in the defects themselves. He ceased to think about his own death. He began to think of life generally, its present lowliness, its valiant aspiration. He found himself regretting bitterly that he was not to see more of this utopian world, which was in so many respects so near an intimation of what our own world may become. It had been very heartening to see human dreams and human ideals vindicated by realization, but it was distressing to have had the vision snatched away while still only beginning to examine it. He found himself asking questions that had no answers for him, about economics, about love and struggle. Anyhow, he was glad to have seen as much as he had. It was good to have been purged by this vision and altogether lifted out of the dreary hopelessness of Mr. Peeve, to have gotten life into perspective again. The passions and conflicts and discomforts of A.D. 1921 were the discomforts of the fever of an uninoculated world. The age of confusion on the earth also would, in its own time, work itself out, thanks to a certain obscure and indomitable righteousness in the blood of the human type. Squatting in a hole in the cliff of the great crag, with unclimbable heights and depths above him, and below chilly, hungry, and comfortable, this thought was a profound comfort to the strangely constituted mind of Mr. Barnstaple. But how miserably had he and his companions failed to rise to the great occasions of Utopia! No one had raised an effectual hand to restrain the puerile imaginations of Mr. Catskill, and the mere brutal aggressiveness of his companions. How invincible had Father Amerton headed for the rôle of the ranting, hating, persecuting, quarrel-making priest! How pitifully weak and dishonest Mr. Burleigh, and himself scarcely better, disapproving always, and always in ineffective opposition! What an unintelligent beauty cow that woman Greta Gray was, receptive, acquisitive, impenetrable to any idea but the idea of what was due to her as a yielding female. Lady Stella was of finer clay, but fired to no service. Women, he thought, had not been well represented in this chance expedition. Just one waster and one ineffective. Was that a fair sample of Earth's womankind? All the use these earthlings had had for Utopia was to turn it back as speedily as possible to the aggressions, subjugations, cruelties, and disorders of the age of confusion to which they belonged. Serpentine and Cetar, the man of scientific power and the man of healing, they had sought to make hostages to disorder, and failing that, they had killed or sought to kill them. They had tried to bring back Utopia to the state of earth, and indeed, but for the folly, malice, and weakness of man, earth was now Utopia. Old earth was Utopia now, a garden and a glory, the earthly paradise, except that it was trampled to dust and ruined by its Catskills, Hunkers, Barralongas, Ridleys, DuPonts, and their kind. Against their hasty, trampling folly nothing was pitted, it seemed, in the whole wide world at present but the whinings of the Peeves, the acquiescent disapproval of the Burleighs, and such immeasurable ineffectiveness as his own protest, and a few writers and teachers who produced results at present untraceable. Once more Mr. Barnstaple found himself thinking of his old friend, the school inspector and schoolbook writer, who had worked so steadfastly and broken down and died so pitifully. He had worked for Utopia all his days. Were there hundreds or thousands of such Utopias yet on earth? What magic upheld them? "I wish I could get some message through to them," said Mr. Barnstaple, "to hearten them." For it was true, though he himself had to starve and die like a fallen beast into a pit, nevertheless Utopia triumphed and would triumph. The grabbers and fighters, the persecutors and patriots, the lynchers and boycotters, and all the riffraff of short-sighted human violence crowded on to final defeat. Even in their lives they know no happiness. They drive with excitement to excitement, and from gratification to exhaustion. Their enterprises and successes, their wars and glories, flare and pass. Only the true thing grows, the truth, the clear idea, year by year and age by age, slowly and invincibly as a diamond grows amidst the darkness and pressures of the earth, or as the dawn grows amidst the guttering lights of some belated orgy. What would be the end of those poor little people up above there? Their hold on life was even more precarious than his own, for he might lie and starve here slowly for weeks before his mind gave its last flicker. But they had openly pitted themselves against the might and wisdom of Utopia, and even now the ordered power of that world must be closing in upon them. He still had a faint irrational remorse for his betrayal of Catskill's ambush. He smiled now at the passionate conviction he had felt at the time that if once Catskill could capture his hostages, Earth might prevail over Utopia. That conviction had rushed him into action. His weak cries had seemed to be all that was left to avert this monstrous disaster. But suppose he had not been there at all, or suppose he had obeyed the lingering instinct of fellowship that urged him to fight with the others. What then? When he recalled the sight of Cedar throwing mush about as one might throw a lapdog about, and the height and shape of Serpentine, he doubted whether, even upon the stairs in the archway, it would have been possible for the earthlings to have overpowered these two. The revolvers would have come into use just as they had come into use upon the slope, and Catskill would have got no hostages but only two murdered men. How unutterably silly the whole scheme of Catskill had been! But it was no sillier than the behavior of Catskill, Burleigh, and the rest of the world's statesmen had been on earth during the last few years. At times during the world agony of the Great War it had seemed that Utopia drew near to earth. The black clouds and smoke of these dark years had been shot with the light of strange hopes, with the promise of a world reborn. But the nationalists, financiers, priests, and patriots had brought all those hopes to nothing. They had trusted to old poisons and infections and to the weak resistances of the civilized spirit. They had counted their weapons and set their ambushes and kept their women busy sowing flags of discord. For a time they had killed hope, but only for a time. For hope, the redeemer of mankind, there is perpetual resurrection. Utopia will win, said Mr. Barnstaple, and for a time he sat listening to a sound he had heard before without heeding it very greatly. Purring throb in the rocks about him, like the running of some great machine. It grew louder and then faded down to the imperceptible again. His thoughts came back to his erstwhile companions. He hoped that they were not too miserable or afraid up there. He was particularly desirous that something should happen to keep up Lady Stella's courage. He worried affectionately about Lady Stella. For the rest, it would be as well if they remained actively combative to the end. Possibly they were all toiling at some preposterous and wildly hopeful defensive scheme of Catskill's. Except Mr. Burleigh, who would be resting, convinced that for him at least there would still be a gentlemanly way out, and perhaps not much afraid if there wasn't. Amerton and possibly Mush might lapse into a religious revival that would irritate the others a little, or possibly even provide a mental opiate for Lady Stella and Miss Greta Gray. Then for Pank there was wine in the cellar. They would follow the laws of their being. They would do the things that nature and habit would require of them. What else was possible? Mr. Barnstaple plunged into a metaphysical gulf. Presently he caught himself looking at his wristwatch. It was 20 minutes past 12. He was looking at his watch more and more frequently, or time was going more slowly. Should he wind his watch or let it run down? He was already feeling very hungry. That could not be real hunger yet. It must be his imagination getting out of control.